The Drifter, Book 10 of the America Falls series. Written by Scott Medbury, narrated by Adam Barr. Part 1. Old Man. Chapter 1. Blood-orange smears dashed the evening sky. The sun melting behind a ridge of chestnut oaks and pine trees found native to the state of Pennsylvania, where the worn boots of the drifter traveled. 10 long years since the fall of America. It felt like a century to Joshua Ragland. His travels across the ruined remains of his home, the United States, showed it to be a shadow of its former glory. For most who survived, memories of the old life had faded. Not for Ragland. He had been 24 when America fell, when nearly all who survived the virus had been 17 at the most. Now, at 34, the world before the virus was like a home he could never go back to, a town across a gorge without a bridge to reach it. Reaching down into his pack, Ragland pulled out a metal flask with an inbuilt filter he'd ripped from another bottle long before it fell apart. He took a long gulp, wiped his beard, and surveyed the hills. This will do, he thought. This will make for a good camping spot. He'd left it a little later than usual, rushing to erect his small tent in the twilight before darkness engulfed him. Around him, in the woods, he could hear the scurrying of possums and cottontails in the leaves. In the distance, the cry of a bobcat echoed, bouncing off the ridge faces and into the inky sky. A tall man, Ragland always had to negotiate and tuck himself into the tent. At over 6'3", it often meant smacking his head on low-hanging branches, too. His collection of bruises and welts were plenty. Happy, with the campfire crackling away, which would keep until the early hours, Ragland had just one more chore before bedding down for the night. Traps. He set them most nights, and with a bit of luck, he would have a fresh breakfast waiting for him when he woke up. Ragland was comfortable living off the land. In the world after the fall, as he called it, law and order existed only in pockets, on the eastern seaboard at least. Gangs of wild kids roamed the lands now. He'd not required the relay of rumor to know of feral gangs and cannibal hordes. Ragland had seen it all. And they didn't just stick to one place. With his own gray eyes, he'd witnessed them scurry and loot in the big cities, desecrate towns, and burn down small villages and settlements. That was most. Some, however, sought the wilds, the spaces between our fallen civilization. One rumor he had heard was of their superstitions. They believed that ghosts claimed dominion of the old places, and said it justified their riotous acts. To him, it was the same old bullshit. But he could never shake the idea of a haunted dimension alongside their own, a dimension filled with the hundreds of millions of souls lost in the space of a few weeks, 10 years before. Standing poised over one of his tripwires, stuck in a reverie, Ragland reached instinctively to his chest, feeling for the necklace. On it, a birthstone. Onyx, the color of deep darkness. It had belonged to someone special to him, someone who died long ago when the virus came and wiped out over half the population. His little sister, Melanie. Ragland's scarred and calloused hand gripped the stone on its leather thong and tried to picture her face again, like a teardrop, with their dad's signature blue eyes. His whole family had blue eyes. Not him. He'd drawn the short straw. The snap of a twig put him on high alert. Dropping his hand, he reached for the hunting knife at his right ankle and drew it, peering into the darkness. After a few minutes of listening intently, he considered himself safe, sheathed the blade, and ensured his tripwire was in order. Back at the tent, Ragland fell straight to sleep, dropping off within minutes. It was the one benefit of living the apocalypse. Back before the virus, he had always suffered from sporadic insomnia. But now, with the world outside as good as ended, and society in America in tatters and set back a century or more, he had never slept better. When he woke from his tangled nest, Ragland pulled himself straight out from his sleeping bag, grabbed his knife, and walked bleary-eyed into the trees in search of breakfast. He'd not walked far, perhaps 100 feet, when he found the squirrel snared in his trap. Bending down, one of his knees poking out of his worn jeans, he prized it free and took it back to camp. He usually caught a rabbit, but squirrel would be enough for him to get started. With plenty of experience, Ragland got the dead fire going again after clearing away the ash. Once he'd skinned and gutted the squirrel, he skewered it on a sharpened stick and held it over the fire. The animal was lean and cooked well enough to eat in 10 minutes. The meat was tasty, not as good as rabbit, but close, and he savored the fatty juices, licking his fingers after he had picked the carcass clean. Leaving no time to watch the sunrise, he packed up his gear, breaking down the tent and stacking it neatly into his backpack. As customary, he cleared the site he'd had the fire, throwing away the rocks and brushing the ground with a leafy branch until there was no trace he had been there. He never liked to stay in one place for longer than was necessary. It invited comfort, laziness, and predictability, all of which could come back to bite him if the moment struck advantageous to a group of raiders or cannibals. No sense sleeping in if it meant waking up with his feet cut off, spit roasting over his own fire. Tossing away the what-if notion, Ragland threw his well-worn backpack over his shoulders, ran a hand through his long brown hair and tied it back from his face with a bandana as he surveyed the way ahead. He decided he'd go north. His last loop around the northern part of Pennsylvania, south of Canada's Lake Erie, proved to be a gold mine for abandoned towns and villages, some still stocked with canned food that would probably last another century. All well and good, but hunting was still his preferred option for food where possible. Sweeping across the eastern states, he'd hunted everything from small fish to elk. The upside to a vastly depleted human population meant the animals thrived and were plentiful in most areas, even returning to their former masters' urban domains, now just concrete and steel shells, vestiges and relics of a world long gone. Of course, the abundance of game and the toppling of the former apex predator, man, brought its own problems. There had been a population explosion of predators, and barely a day passed where he didn't have to avoid an animal with the capacity to kill him. Wolves, cougars, mountain lions, bears, he had seen them all. Predators weren't the only ones flourishing, though. A year ago, a group of traders had told Ragland of a rumor that bison had returned to the sweeping hills of Wyoming. He had yet to set his eyes on this miracle. Lucrative though it might be, the traders risked a lot by heading west into the occupied territories. He hadn't yet taken the chance, but thought he'd like to before he died. One last long trek all the way west to the beaches of California. That said, he had witnessed many other miracles in his lonely travels. Of course, he stopped at the occasional town or village to resupply, but only his time out in the wilds revealed the New World's most incredible beauties. Tranquil lakes glistening under a golden sun, untouched by man for years. Farmland gone wild, as far as the eye can see. A rich explosion of life. He'd seen so much. With the sun now rising cleanly from behind the pines, its pale light illuminated his lean, bearded face, and he smiled. He'd always hoped to have a backyard with his first house. Now, he had over 6 million square miles to play with. The apocalypse wasn't without its silver linings. Chapter 2. Ragland's descent from his campsite was less treacherous than he had anticipated, the ground not so slippery, with plenty of grip on his old boots granting him purchase. The plan for the day would be to navigate the small stream to the north, climb the next ridge, and get his bearings on any nearby settlements, so as to avoid them. Almost fully stocked, he had no reason to entertain the presence of people. Around him, as he navigated the way down, he could hear a chorus of birds above him, dancing and fluttering between the branches. The further he descended, the more he could make out the distant trickle of water. Beneath his boots, small twigs snapped, and the first leaves of fall wedged themselves into the grooves. Despite the time of year, Ragland had earned himself a decent sweat by the time he reached the bottom. Taking a breath, he drained the rest of his filtered water and followed the sound of the stream. Out on the streets, he suddenly started singing to himself, spying the glint of midday sun off the water between the trees. That's where we'll meet. A song he had once heard his dad sing. A song he hadn't heard played in a long, long time. Ragland would give anything to hear recorded music again, and a device he had looked for on his travels, one which was top of the list, was a record player, one he could finally use to listen to music the way his dad's generation had. He'd heard of some still lying around, but he was yet to come across one that didn't require power from a grid that no longer ran. A battery-operated one was what was needed. During his many supermarket raids in the early days, batteries were a dime a dozen. He found old MP3 players, Walkmans, and even a cassette tape player that all worked on batteries. During the first few years, he'd listened to a lot of music, but it didn't last. Over time, as others sought to ransack those last vestiges of technology, the batteries dwindled and became extinct. Now, only some major towns and cities had any left, but they were still hard to come by. Ragland felt like each year that passed took them further back in time. It didn't feel like the 21st century anymore, not even the 20th, and traveling had proven that notion. Crouching, and still singing, Ragland dipped his water flask into the stream, the filtering device at the top already at work. His badly out-of-tune song played to a small family of elk drinking on the northern shore. He paused then, watched, took in the gleam of their fine chestnut coats, their shiny bauble eyes beneath long eyelashes. A scurry to the east had a few of them raise and crane their heads. The buck noticed Ragland and gazed at him warily. For some reason, he found himself raising a hand in greeting. The buck blinked. Come here often? The buck dipped his head back to the water. Not much for chit-chat, I see. Smiling, he rummaged through his bag and pulled out a bag of nuts and berries he'd been collecting, a skill he'd taken the time to perfect, not keen on finding an abandoned bus to shit himself to death in. Thirst quenched and belly full, Ragland saw off the elk as they traveled west down the stream, leaving his way open to cross the shallow middle to the other side. The gradual incline of the valley opposite meant he could keep his pace without tiring himself for hunting. Back between the pines, he bent low to look out for signs of life, keen to start hunting early, before the sunset in 6 or so hours. He'd quickly learned in his first year in the wild that time slipped away when you got busy hunting. It didn't take long for him to find the prints of a medium-sized bird, a wild turkey if experience served him well. Gripping his bow carefully, it was always strapped vertically to his backpack. He took out an arrow and held it against the limb of the bow, not yet wanting to notch. That would come later. And turkey was his favorite. With males weighing in at over 20 pounds if they were big and healthy, just their heart boiled in salt water would provide him enough for a good snack, the rest of the carcass easily feeding him for the next 2 days before it spoiled. Unlike the hellish episode he'd had recently with groundhogs, Ragland found that he had much better luck with turkeys. Their wing and claw marks on the ground, and the little dust bowls they left on the forest floor, were all telltale signs. Today, he was feeling a bit cocky. Today, he would feast. His mouth was already watering when he caught what sounded like, at the very least, a small flock of wild turkey. Ragland climbed across a particularly rocky outcrop, kneeling to spy his prize. And there they were. Foraging just 20 feet ahead, they remained ignorant to his presence. Using this window, Ragland notched an arrow onto his bowstring, pulling it back, feeling the resistance, keeping it in line with his chin and nose, a straight, accurate line for precision shooting. He'd seen other hunters prefer the more unorthodox method of pulling it to their cheek, but he felt it never guaranteed accuracy like his way, and he'd never gone hungry. Taking measure of the distance, the stillness of the air, and the cool temperature, he exhaled slowly, feeling his chest depress, and then loosed his arrow. Feather and shaft cut through the air like a knife, finding its way home in the lower neck of one of the turkeys. The others scattered instantly, dashing between the trees in different directions, their wings scraping the forest floor. Feeling uncharacteristically smug, he continued to admire his shot, and it almost cost him his dinner. A bobcat's whiskers, then its head, appeared from the shadows between a few closely knitted trees, prowling toward the dead turkey. Ragland paused, stock still, not having heard it coming. In all his time in the wild, he'd heard the cry and scream of a bobcat maybe a half-dozen times. They were incredibly agile and silent hunters. Sensing Ragland was poised to move, the bobcat moved quickly to claim the turkey, grabbing the scrawny neck between its jaws. "Fucker!" Ragland bolted forward, scaring the bobcat away, but as he did so, a sharp, hot pain seared in his ankle, and he came crashing down. "Christ!" he screamed. The lynx rufus, the scientific name Ragland knew from reading books on his journeys, had vanished, along with his dinner and his precious arrow, leaving him sprawled on the muddy ground, clutching his ankle. "A lesson for you, you cocky bastard," he admonished himself. He'd let his long years of successful hunting and ego best him for just a split second, and it had come back to bite him on the ass. Wincing and pulling himself up slowly, he tested the weight on his twisted ankle and felt it to be much more manageable than he'd anticipated. In fact, he had the feeling he would walk it off in a few hours. The same could not be said for his pride, which was significantly battered. Ragland continued towards the top of the ridge, checking absent-mindedly for any other tracks to pursue. After an hour of fruitless tracking, he found a fresh set of claw marks, but his attention had been drawn to something else. A voice. Dropping down to his haunches, Ragland immediately froze, scanning the woods around him for the source of the voice. Male. No. 2 voices. No, 3. He tilted his head and held his breath as he listened to pinpoint their location. They were downwind, further east along the hill, maybe a little higher up. Torn between curiosity and caution, Ragland decided to gain height and vantage. With bow and arrows stashed away, and running in a low crouch, he closed the distance to the voices and made his way further up the incline to a large outcropping. When he was settled, he saw them below, some 50 feet away. 3 rough-looking young men, in all black. One of them turned toward the lip of the precipice that hid Ragland, and he could see the smears of crimson on his cheeks. Blood. "Cannibals," he mouthed, ducking lower, so only his eyes peeked through the undergrowth, his right hand touching the knife in his boot to make sure it was there. They were talking amongst themselves, hurriedly, debating about how to split up. Then, catching Ragland off guard, one of the cannibals screamed, pointing further down the hill toward another figure. "Meat!" he screeched. The words fell cold against his skin, making the hairs on his neck stand on end. The war cry was something he'd heard plenty of times before. Cannibals did not see people for who they were, only what they were. Meat. The figure in the distance froze for a second, then took off but stumbled as they ran, falling, and they were quickly set upon by the cannibals. Ragland stayed hidden, an audience to their hunt. Their movements were quick, decisive, and merciless. He saw their quarry was a female, and as he watched, the laughing cannibals took her arms and legs and carried her back towards the small camp they'd made below Ragland's hiding spot. The prisoner screamed. As they drew closer, Ragland could see she was young, perhaps only in her late teens. She was putting up a pretty good fight, reaching across to bite one of the cannibals on the arm. He dropped her, and she took a chance to leap up and kick another square in the balls. A howl from him went up, piercing the canopy above. Ouch. Ragland thought she might just fight her way free and make a run for it. But the third cannibal, the biggest of them, stepped forward and unleashed a roundhouse punch that took her on the temple. Like a rag doll, she fell in a heap on the leafy floor. "No!" Ragland gasped involuntarily. Though not a yell, his voice carried, stirring the ears of the cannibal who had been bitten. His dark, murderous eyes scanned the ridge where he hid. After a few seconds, with Ragland holding his breath and blood pounding in his ears, the cannibal decided it was nothing and moved to help tie up their meal. As they turned the teenager over, Ragland caught sight of her face and froze. It was Melanie. "No. She's dead, Josh. Dead. You're seeing things again." But the resemblance was unmistakable. The same long black hair, the same Roman nose, the same brow. She looked just like his sister Melanie. Taking stock of the situation, wanting to take advantage of their vulnerability, Ragland pulled his knife from its ankle sheath and was seconds from pouncing when a fourth man approached from the west, slow and deliberate in his movements. He spoke in a deep voice. "We take her to the pack," he spoke, surveying the girl who lay motionless, her arms and legs bound. "He will want to see." The other three nodded, the large one picking her up and throwing her over his shoulder. He was easily as tall as Ragland, but broader across the back. It would take a lot to put someone like that in the dirt, but a well-placed arrow would be all he'd need. As the cannibals moved off, heading northeast away from him and up the ridge, Ragland decided against his better judgment that he would need to get involved. He was going to kill every one of them. Chapter 3. Ragland's stomach growled like a wolf as the crescent moon peeped over the swaying treetops. A sweet breeze reached his nose, but soon soured with the greasy sweat of his prey. The cannibals were close. For the last few hours he'd kept slow and at least a quarter-mile away. The last thing he wanted was to alert them. At this distance he could easily track and keep them in sight. If the day had taught him one thing, it was to stay true to his own habits. Be slow, be cautious, be deliberate. He had no idea where their camp would be or how permanent it was. His familiarity with the area wasn't the best, but as they crested the ridge by dusk, he could see a few winks of light below in a clearing, no doubt their camp. How many would be there, he thought? Would he be met with a whole pack of them? If so, how would he free the girl? As good a hunter as he was, he wouldn't be able to take on more than half a dozen of them, and even then, stealth and surprise would have to work in his favor. Ragland let the distance between he and the cannibals grow as they moved down the slope, descending to the camp. He was keen to avoid dislodging stray rocks or making any noise that might give away his presence. His patience paid dividends when they reached the camp just a half-hour later, his existence still undetected. Sticking to the shadows just outside the camp, Ragland began to survey and recon the area to get a good head count. The cannibals, 4 to the party, had mentioned another, so he knew already there would be a minimum of 5 to deal with. Circling slowly, avoiding any dry twigs underfoot, he soon learned that the hunting party was only the 4, plus 1, their leader. Dressed only in black pants, he was a gruesome sight. His lean, muscled torso covered in dried blood and other markings. To top off his outfit, he wore a gruesome necklace of ears and fingers. Once he was satisfied it was only a party of 5, Ragland pinpointed the girl's location. She was tied against a tree at the center of the camp, head lolling on her chest where she sat, legs bent to the left. "How are you going to do this, Josh?" He closed his eyes and listened to their muttering, their footsteps, the crackle of logs on the campfire. He could smell the musky smoke, the pine charring in the heat. It whistled in the night, a sound Ragland had grown to love like a friend. As he circled them, a plan formulated in his head. He noticed the ringleader was hanging around the girl, pointing and prodding as she recoiled from his touch. She was gagged, with no chance to scream for help. The other 4 were split into 2 pairs. Closer to the girl and their boss, the 2 smaller men huddled together, nudging and pushing each other between laughs. These 2 were clearly zombs. Cannibalism had become rife in the years after the attack and the retreat of the invading army. A lot could be said of their Chinese conquerors, but at least they fed the children they enslaved. No one knew where or how it started, but over the years the consumption of human meat had taken its toll on the very young, those whose brains hadn't fully developed before they chose or were forced into the gruesome eating habits. Whilst eating human flesh was repulsive, it was no more dangerous than other meat, if cooked properly. Unfortunately, the starving children and teens who had started the horrible practice hadn't been fussy about cooking meat properly or supplementing their diet with vegetables. It left them with poor brain and physical development, with some even incapable of speech. The ones already in their teens had fared better, those in their 20s now, but many still suffered from their appalling diet. The result was that the cannibals had developed a 2-tiered society: Zoms, the developmentally challenged, and Norms, the older, less affected ones who ruled over them. Ragland could make out between the giggles that these 2 were deciding what parts of the girl they would eat first. He felt the embers of rage begin to glow deep inside him. He continued around the camp in a southerly direction. On the western side of the big campfire were the other 2. They were Norms. The largest man leaned against a big tree about 25 feet away, facing south, and relieving himself in the dark, while his shorter friend sat on a fallen tree 10 feet closer, sharpening a knife on a whetstone. His back was to the bushes where Ragland lurked. Hidden from the other 3 by the roaring fire and surrounding dark, he saw his chance. Thick fingers gripped his knife as he crept up on his first victim. Reaching out, he clasped a hand over the cannibal's mouth and sliced his throat open with a quick movement. He held the struggling man as he bled out, spraying the foliage and ground black in the darkness. The struggle didn't last long, and with his eyes on the larger cannibal, he eased his victim down to the ground. He took a split second to visualize his next move. This man was the biggest of them, and he needed to make sure he got it right the first time. His life and that of the girl depended on it. Sprinting forward to apply as much force as possible, Ragland launched his left foot into the back of the man's left knee, buckling him just as he was zipping up. Before the man could cry out, Ragland had already gripped him by the hair and reefed his head backward before hammering his blade deep into the man's right eye. He fell without a whimper. 2 down, 3 to go. Wiping his hands clean, he circled back and reevaluated his chances. The Zombs were so hectic and noisy that an attack silencing them would almost certainly alert the leader. He would put a knife in the girl's belly, and it would all have been for nothing. No, he'd have to cut the head off the snake first. He moved forward, pressing a finger to his lips so the girl wouldn't give him away. It was too little, or too late. Her eyes widened at the sight of him, and the cannibal leader spun around before Ragland could close the gap. The cannibal's yell of alarm tore the silence and echoed from the trees. Bats fluttered out from the canopy, and rodents scurried with fright. With his bloodied knife in hand, Ragland was momentarily frozen as his mind sought a solution to this new problem. A half-second passed before he spun the knife, pinched the tip of the blade, and raised it to his ear before launching it and breaking into a run to follow its course. The steel blade found its home, buried hilt deep in the cannibal's muscled chest, and he dropped to his knees, looking down at the worn handle as if trying to figure out what it was. "Meat!" one of the Zombs screeched behind him. Ragland decided the leader posed no further threat and spun around, drawing his bow. Adrenaline was thrumming through his system, and his rapid heartbeat drowned out the noise of his surroundings. Nocking an arrow, he took aim at the Zombs who were running helter-skelter towards him, drool flying from their mouths. His arrow whipped through the dark and suddenly came still in one of their eye sockets. The Zomb wobbled, as if confused, before his legs stopped working, and he fell face first into the dirt. His friend didn't notice and continued his charge. Ragland drew another arrow but fumbled the shot and watched as it whizzed by the bastard's pointy head. It was too late to knock another, and the cannibal hopped, then skipped, and then launched himself from a rock and crashed into Ragland, sending them both sprawling to the dirt beside the campfire. "Meat!" he shrieked again. Ragland saw the crazy in his eyes, and he had no doubt the teenager was mad with whatever rotten disease you earned for eating the meat of your own species. His attacker's charnel breath took his breath away, and as he struggled, he turned his face away to avoid the drool dripping from the sharpened teeth. The son of a bitch was strong for his size. The crazed Zomb pressed a forearm down on Ragland's windpipe and secured his legs so he couldn't wriggle away. Ragland punched his face and rock-hard head, but all it did was irritate the cannibal and hurt his knuckles. With the air slowly choked from him, he started to see static crawl in the edges of his vision. He was passing out. In a last-ditch effort to survive, his hand scrabbled at the edges of the campfire until it found a smoldering stick. The pain from the heat was immense, but he ignored it and drove the glowing point as hard as he could into the cannibal's ribcage. The other man squealed in agony, falling from Ragland as if he were molten to the touch, and writhed on the ground trying to pull the stick out. Staring down at the angry red welts on his palm, Ragland ground his teeth in both pain and anger. He didn't waste time tending to the wound, but quickly turned to the leader, who was still kneeling, looking dumbly at the knife in his chest. Ragland gripped the handle of his hunting knife, put a foot to the man's chest, and ripped it free, kicking him onto his back before turning to face the Zomb. The surviving cannibal was in no state to fight. He lay on the ground in the fetal position, crying pitifully. Ragland felt no pity. He knelt and drove the blade deep between the C2 and C3 vertebrae of the cannibal's neck, driving it until it protruded from his gargling mouth like a silver tongue. He glanced back at the leader. The man was on his back, staring sightlessly at the sky. With the job done, A huge sigh escaped him. He had almost forgotten the girl in the heat of battle, and his heartbeat was only just beginning to slow as he staggered over, covered in dirt and blood, with his knife at the ready to cut the girl's ropes. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you," he said, watching her flinch as he knelt beside her. The blade sawed through the bonds with ease. He reached up for her gag and paused. "Don't scream, okay? I'm here to help. They're gone now. Dealt with." Ragland pulled the bunched cloth from her mouth. While she didn't scream out loud, she did scream with her big, round eyes, and stayed rooted to the spot in absolute terror. He wagered that it may have been the first time she'd seen such violence. That surprised him, living in a world like this. Once she was set free, Ragland helped the girl up, but she lurched away from his hands and climbed to her feet before stepping a safe distance away and casting an eye over the bodies and blood. She promptly bent over and vomited, the hot rush splattering in the dirt like lava on sand. "Easy there," Ragland said. "We need to get you out of here. Where's your settlement or village?" The girl's shoulders heaved again, then stopped. Wiping her mouth, she rose slowly, suddenly shaking from the cold. Ragland spied one of the cannibals' jackets nearby and threw it to her. "Here." She caught it wordlessly, draping it over her shoulders. Ragland had to close his mouth. In the poor light, this girl really did look like Melanie. The same fine features and complexion, framed by long black hair. He rubbed his eyes to make sure the campfire wasn't playing tricks on him. "Where do you live?" he asked again. No answer. She stood silent, helpless. A howl nearby pricked their ears. The smell of blood would have cougars and wolves eager for a midnight snack here in no time. Not wanting to waste any more time, preferring to take their chances in the darkness, Ragland grabbed her by the arm and tugged her away from camp, heading down into the trees. "We need to go, now." She resisted at first, then stumbled on reluctantly, keeping pace with them as they descended into the shadows, the flickering light of the cannibals' camp vanishing in the thickets and tree branches behind them. In the distance, echoing across the wooded hills, the howl of a wolf spurred them on. Chapter 4. "Keep up," Ragland rasped, glancing back to see the girl trudging behind. He'd assumed the sun had risen, assumed only because he couldn't see it through the thick fog that clung to the valley they'd walked into. The trees grew thin on the valley floor, opening into a vast grassland before the next ridge. She jogged, matching Ragland's speed, and glanced at him, fearful still, cautious, wondering where he was going. With not a single word spoken since he'd rescued her from the cannibals, Ragland had no information about where she had come from, where her settlement was, or even her goddamn name. "You don't speak much, do you?" he grumbled, cleaning one of his arrowheads with a cloth. "Nothing. If you don't speak by noon, and I know you can speak, I know it, then we're going to have to part ways, you and I." She frowned at him, measuring his words, but said nothing. "Well then," he smirked, "that settles that. I think we best get us breakfast." His arrows were quickly bloodied, finding not one but 2 cottontails whipping through the field. Back as a kid, he'd loved animals, couldn't bear the thought of harming a single hair on their heads, not even a mouse. Now, 10 years deep into the new world, he didn't so much as blink. It was just life. Eat or die. He cut them and pulled the furs off the carcasses like a glove with a soft thrup sound, revealing the purple-red meat beneath. The girl didn't blink, which told Ragland she may be new to human violence, but was no stranger to hunting or butchering. With the ground damp, it took him a little longer than usual to find enough dry kindling for a fire. As sure as it always was, the fire was soon popping. 2 rabbits spitting across the flames, fat dropping onto the logs and hissing. The girl sat on a rock, knees close together, arms wrapped tight around them. She stared at the rabbit, not blinking. And once again Ragland was reminded just how much she looked like Melanie. Her stomach growled as loud as any hungry bear's. "Eat," he said, pointing his knife at the rabbit. No movement. "It ain't a request, kid. I need your strength for the hike tomorrow. Nothing but hills and ridges north of here." She glanced at him, shuffling her weight a little, but decided against it. Wow, he thought. Those fuckers really did a number on her. Sympathizing, he took the second rabbit off the fire, stuck one end of the stick into the ground between 2 campfire rocks, and cut off a wedge of cooked meat like a kebab, handing it over to her. Her hand flashed out and grabbed the food. Ragland had barely blinked and she'd consumed the entire piece. "There we go. You're going to have to sort the res—" But she had gotten the hint, tearing at the rabbit with her bare fingers and wolfing the meat down like she hadn't eaten in days. And maybe she hadn't. Ragland watched her ravenous movements with a pang. The resemblance didn't help things, and he found it difficult to compartmentalize what he was seeing, to separate himself and his emotions. For all his travels, he'd witnessed a lot of suffering and pain. New mothers not able to feed their babies, young kids orphaned by the virus, fighting for scraps outside trash heaps. Yet for all of it, this sight hit the deepest. Sighing, almost choking on the smoke that suddenly turned in his direction, he went back to his own meal, methodically peeling the meat away from cartilage and bone. A habit Ragland knew had been essential to his survival this long had been traps, and not just the kind that secured his breakfast. No. These ones were the others who followed, hoping for a quick finish. Ragland always deprived them of that. Just before noon, he knelt to check the tracks he and the silent girl had made on their walk north. The grass before had left deep, sodden impressions, with numerous twigs in the woods snapped and ripped from nearby shrubs. Perfect. Choosing a particularly overgrown section of the climb, Ragland reached into his bag and pulled out a shotgun slug, something he only used in emergencies. The girl watched as he worked the trap. Her curiosity piqued for the first time since he'd rescued her. Setting a thin piece of fishing wire from one tree to the next, he hooked it to a small trap on the bark shrouded in leaves and attached the shotgun shell to it. Standing up with a groan, feeling his left knee pop, he motioned to it as he walked back up to her. "Just in case we're followed. Won't kill 'em, but we'll hear them from miles off." A blink. Ragland supposed that was as good as it was going to get with her, jokingly wondering if he'd arrived after they'd cut her tongue out. It was silence from the trauma. Had to be. He'd seen it a few times before when he'd helped a few folks out here and there. The terror of what they'd endured would render them frozen, a defense mechanism, and a way for the brain to protect itself. Maybe it was the same for her. But he'd never seen it last more than a few hours, and it was now almost a full day since he'd found her. He let his mind ponder what might have happened to her if he hadn't been on the scene. Thankful he'd put down the trap sooner rather than later, he shivered, not from the cold, and lugged his weight up the ridge to the top, the girl in tow, making no complaints. He had to give her that. She never complained. The rest of the day fell away to the night quicker than he'd anticipated, with the pair falling into a rhythm that felt hypnotic and regulated their breathing to keep them going. But with moisture in the air, he felt damp from the exertion, sweat seeping into his clothes. Reaching the top of another ridge, he spied a slightly flatter area of terrain toward the northeast, toward a route he'd take to hike to New York, and eventually Maine. "We'll stop here for the night," Ragland called to her as she hid behind a set of trees to relieve herself. Setting his backpack and things down in a spot blanketed by pine needles, he stretched and rolled his shoulders to relieve the stiffness. Next, he cleared a spot in the earth, then moved off to find wood for the fire that would be supplemented by a fistful of spare twigs he'd collected at their morning camp. The silent girl loped off to help. "Not too far," he said. She nodded, and with another pair of hands he had a pile ready and a new fire going within minutes. Thoroughly pleased with the efficiency, he found himself grinning as he fed some of the twigs into the fire to stoke it. "You know, I can't recall the last time I had a camp companion. God, it must have been at least 3 years ago, maybe more." He stopped, suddenly aware that he'd spoken more words in 24 hours to his mute audience than he had in months. Noticing the pause, the girl looked up from warming her hands to regard him with big, inquisitive eyes. "Not gonna say a word, are you?" She stared. "We doing this? Because I did say I'd cut you loose if you didn't tell me at least your name. In fact," he grumbled, checking the setting sun through the clouds, "I'd say I've given you a good few hours leeway, right?" Nothing. She went back to warming her hands. "I want you gone by morning," he said. And he meant it. Without knowing who she was or where she came from, regardless of who she looked like, it could bite him right on the ass. She could be part of a group that would make the cannibals look like a knitting circle, people who might slit his throat in the night as easy as they would a turkey. Thinking about turkey, he ducked into the pack and pulled out the cut remains of their rabbit from the morning. It would be good to eat now, but any left would have to be thrown away, with no way to keep it from spoiling. His dark eyes buried themselves in the crackling fire. He fell into another one of his reveries, so lost to the world that he almost missed what she said. "Kit." Ragland almost choked on his rabbit, thumping himself in the chest to wrestle himself back from death. "Jesus fuck. She speaks. What's that, Kit? That's your name?" "Yes." He'd imagined a softer voice coming from that delicate face. But instead it was something far raspier, not exactly like a bartender who smoked 10 a day, but certainly husky. "Great," he said. "Guess you get to stay at the Ragland Motel for another night. Watch out for the bedbugs, they're everywhere." She smirked, which only fueled his freshly minted good mood. "Want the rest of mine?" "Sure," she repeated, reaching out to take the leftover rabbit, munching away happily. "I'm going to have to teach you to hunt the way you eat. God damn." "I hunt." "What?" Kit swallowed the last of the food, wiping her mouth with the back of her jacket. "I can hunt." "Like small game or bigger?" She nodded. "Both. That's good, he said, twisting the tip of his blade into a log next to him. "Is that how they got you? Out hunting too far from your settlement?" Kit looked to pull back in on herself, building back the walls he'd finally managed to break down. He'd hit a nerve. "It's okay. You don't have to say a thing." "It's fine," she sighed, shoulders rolling forward as she poked a long stick into the fire, causing a dusting of sparks to leap up from the ash. "It was my own fault. They warned me before." "They? Your group?" Kit nodded, then pointed to his chest. "What's that?" Ragland looked down, plucking up his sister's onyx necklace. "It's something I keep to remember someone close to me. I lost her, my sister, at the start of the fall when everything happened. I've been alone ever since." Speaking the words seemed to hit him harder than the nightmares had in years. It took a great deal of control to compose himself, thankful the night had drawn in quickly, leaving the light of the fire little chance to illuminate his expression. "I'm sorry," Kit said. "How old was she?" 17. "That's rough." "Yeah," he said. "What about you? We need to get you home. Are you ready to tell me so we can call time on this rescue operation? Or am I going to get that silent treatment again?" "No," she said, looking back at the fire. "I'm sorry about that. I just didn't trust you." "Trust me? I saved your goddamn life." Kit threw the stick into the fire. "Well, for me it was 5 men with weapons taking me, and then another took their place." "Wow," he said, incredulous. "I fed you and kept you safe. I don't see any bonds on your wrists or ankles." "I didn't ask for you to save me." Ragland threw his head back and barked with laughter. "So what? You were just biding your time before you took them all on yourself?" Kit remained silent, picking up a fresh stick to stoke the fire. Afraid he'd lose her again, Ragland reined in his ego, shook his head, and gestured toward her. But before he could make the speech, she was already speaking. "I've decided to trust you." Ragland was pleasantly surprised. "Why is that? Ragland Motel serves the best cottontail roast in Pennsylvania?" "No, jerk," she smirked. "That necklace. A lady in our town has something similar. Different type, but she keeps it to remember someone, too. She's the nicest one there, at least in my opinion. But whatever. So yeah, I guess I trust you, old man." "Old man?" Ragland scoffed, slightly offended. "Yeah, go figure. All the old ones died out except you. What are you, like 50? He got up from his perch, knowing he'd be about ready for bed after a quick check on his traps. As he rolled out his sleeping mat, he looked over his shoulder at her silhouette against the dwindling campfire. "I'm 34, you cheeky shit." "Damn." "And you?" 17. That figured. Not only like Melanie, but the same age, too. Busying himself with checking the traps shortly after the tent was ready, he staggered back, yawning, suddenly aware of how tired he was from having to worry about another human being. It had sapped him of his energy. "Nice to meet you, Kit," he said before rolling over to sleep. "Let's get some shut-eye." Chapter 5. Once the dam was breached, Ragland couldn't stem the flow of words. From the moment the sun rose the next day, Kit wouldn't stop talking. She would recall the last time she hunted, her favorite food to eat, the meals she disliked most. On and on it went. But nothing about where she was from or her people. That nugget of knowledge, clearly, she kept locked away. Ragland had a name, Kit, and that was a good start. Perhaps if he could gain more of her trust, he'd finally obtain the name and location of her settlement, so he could deliver her and be on his way. As nice as it was to have company, Ragland was a loner and somewhat of an introvert. Large crowds, or even the occasional companion, were a big no in his rule book. Things were never simple with people. They bred trouble. Small talk turned to conversation. Conversation became gossip. Gossip became lies, which then turned into arguments. Arguments became fights. And then, before you knew it, all hell broke loose. No. Best that he kept well away from people and their problems.
So, like I said, Kit rattled on, storming through the last of Ragland's ration of nuts, I go out hunting all the time. It's no biggie. All the guys do. Most of the girls don't, though, but I don't give a shit. We all need to eat, so no point just, sitting around making blankets or whatever, right?
Ragland was trying his best not to listen. The sun was high in the sky, and she'd been talking for hours. And now it was to the point that he was silently wishing he'd never heard her screams in the first place. This is what you get for getting involved, Josh.
Right?
Tell you what, Ragland huffed, putting down his pack. Take my bow, go get lunch. He pulled the worn limb from his shoulder and handed the bow and a few arrows to Kit, who suddenly didn't look too enthusiastic.
What?
Go get us lunch, he said.
Like, right now? You want me to go find game?
Ragland nodded, trying not to lose his patience. Sure.
Okay, you trust me with this? I mean, you don't even know me, and you're just giving me your gear that you need, and...
He stared at her with raised eyebrows and folded his arms.
Okay, geez, I'm going.
She put the bow over her shoulder and, holding the arrows in a tight grip, jogged off into the trees, missing some tracks Ragland had hoped she'd spot. Great going, he thought. We'll be lucky to eat by sundown. With his pack rearranged to accommodate new supplies of foraged food, he made to put his feet up and take a quick nap when he heard footsteps approaching from the west. Jumping up and reaching for his hunting knife, Ragland ducked low and scanned the undergrowth. Then, with a turkey in each hand, an arrow in her mouth, and the bow slung over her shoulders, Kit practically swaggered into their campsite and dropped them at his feet.
What do you reckon to a pair of gobblers, old man?
She spat the arrow into her free hand and handed it and the bow back to him. Thanks, he said, hiding how impressed he was. No trouble.
Nope. Easy like Wednesday morning.
You mean easy like Sunday morning?
It's not Sunday,
she laughed, oblivious to the song reference.
It's Wednesday.
Ragland closed his eyes and pressed his thumbs into them. That's not what I... Never mind. Grab those turkeys. We're heading north before we break again for camp and dinner. And stop calling me old man, will you?
Sure thing, Gramps.
He ignored it. His spirits lifted by the fact her bravado about hunting wasn't bullshit after all. She was quick with her words, but so far, none of it had been a lie. As much as he could tell, anyway. Their hike carried them over a set of low, rolling hills covered in more woods. When they came across old roads, they crossed with caution. The tarmac in this part of the country was long weathered by Mother Nature, cracked and crumbled by wild grass and encroaching tree roots. It would be reckless to navigate the old ways in their present condition, particularly when one could also run across more human problems, too. He'd learned a while ago, when their deterioration truly started to take hold, that it was best to go horseback by daylight or cross-country by foot, never in a wagon and never at night. He heard the gentle trickle of water running over rocks to his right, so they detoured and stopped briefly to refill his flask. Ragland was getting through at least twice the water now with his sidekick. Mid-afternoon came in cooler than he anticipated. Winter was just around the corner. He debated taking out an extra layer from his pack, but decided against it, removing his water flask instead. It was then, pausing for a break, that he'd realized he'd finally tuned Kit's incessant voice out. He found out because she'd thumped him on the arm.
Hey, Gramps, you home? You hear a thing I said back there?
Not really. Kit shook her head, folding her arms.
Asshole.
Ragland tossed the bottle aside and raised his hands above his head. That's it. I can't do it. I tried. Really, I did.
Just tell me where your goddamn town is right now, or so help me God. Kit froze, pursing her lips together. Melanie used to do that too, and it only pissed him off more. God damn it! He picked up his bottle, tucked it back into his pack, and grabbed the turkeys off the girl, who still stood rigid, refusing to speak. Have a nice life, and good luck getting back. It'd be a lie to say he didn't feel a little betrayed to not have more trust from someone he'd saved from being beaten, raped, and eaten by cannibals. Then again, he understood her side, too. He really did. He just lived better on his own. He had only taken a few dozen steps south when she called out, "Bakerstown." Ragland stopped, debating whether it was still worth the trouble. He felt the onyx necklace against his chest. It sat at a slight angle and was digging in where the bow's limb met it, almost like a divine sign from beyond the veil. His sister, telling him what an ass he was being. And maybe she was right. He turned, walked back up the hill, and gave her the turkeys back. How far? Not far, she said, glancing at her surroundings. We were walking in the right direction anyway. Another half day northeast, and we should reach Reuben's hunting lodge. Hang on. I thought you said you were from Bakerstown. I am. The lodge is a half-mile outside the town. It's a checkpoint for anyone who travels south to hunt. Is that why you kept your mouth shut? Because I just so happened to be heading the way you wanted? A slow nod. Ragland swore and decided it best to get a good pace on. With any luck, this time tomorrow, he'd be free of her and back to his nomad life in the mountains, alone and happy. Chapter 6. Ragland's knees welcomed the gradual slope down into the wooded valley. They'd been hiking for hours and were now just a few miles away from Reuben's hunting lodge, according to Kit. His joints were a far cry from their glory days, the creaks and aches signifying his nutrient-deficient diet and accumulated injuries during his 10 years of trekking through rough landscape. How long could he keep it up, he thought, until he'd need a Gandalf staff? He let a laugh best him, which drew Kit's attention. Holy shit, was that genuine? Sure, why not? Kit shrugged. Just saying, you don't laugh so much, Gramps. Ragland knew she was right, but he failed to see how it made a difference to surviving. The less noise, the better. Another reason it had been difficult to tolerate her rambling. You should laugh more. It's like good for you. When life is taking a shit on things, you got two choices, right? You can either cry or you can laugh. That one of yours? No, she said pensively. Something someone told me a long time ago. They sound wise. They were. Ragland didn't miss the past tense and wondered then about her past. Perhaps, just like his, it was stained with trauma and loss. So, that's your mantra? Kit shook her head, frown turning into a grin. Nah. My mantra is talk trash, get mashed. And I live by it, old man. So don't try any of that knife kung fu on me, or you'll be eating dirt. That's so. Yeah. They both exchanged a quick look to see who would break first, and both laughed. Above them, the sky was clear, a pale metallic blue, turning to a navy beyond the next ridge as the day marched on. Ragland squinted at the sun, almost missing a circle of birds just a quarter-mile from where they stood. He threw out an arm to stop Kit, almost winding her. Hey, what the fuck? She stopped, seeing the birds Ragland was pointing to. So what? It's probably a dead animal. No, he said. Something seems off. Kit rolled her eyes. Oh, sure. What could it be, Gramps? A body? Maybe even a trap? After what you did to those cannibals, though, it can't be them, unless they came back to life."
Ragland raised a finger to his lips. "We go check it out. Might be nothing, but might also be nothing good. If so, then we detour west. Stay low and quiet." She decided to obey, not wanting to neglect the unease that had crept into her bones, a prickling that ran along her arms and up her back. Something did feel wrong. When the pair broke through a throng of tightly set young pines, Ragland motioned Kit to copy him and squat down low. With the sun setting, she couldn't see a thing in the half-light, but he pointed a finger ahead. "There, just by the fallen tree," he whispered. Kit's eyes scanned the area and finally saw it. A dead buck. "I see it." Ragland notched an arrow into his bow and waited some more. Kit grew restless, shuffling her weight from left to right. "What now?" she said. "It's a trap. We leave. Now." A rogue cloud swamped the sun, which was now low on the horizon. Darkness fell over them, and the howl of a wolf pierced the temporary twilight. Kit and Ragland looked at each other, and he saw her eyes were filled with terror. Not needing to be told, she turned and followed Ragland at a quick pace back west up the valley side, moving so fast she nearly stumbled. "Oh, God! Oh, God! Oh, God!" she repeated, breathing heavily and trying her best to keep up with Ragland, who had lengthened his stride. "We need to keep going," he called back. "Their pack will be in the area." "Won't they be occupied by the buck?" "No, he's already been gutted." Kit clutched at a stitch, navigating an outcropping on their right. "So they've eaten? Great. Can we slow down?" "No," he repeated. "It was a trap. Someone left it there. They'd taken what they wanted. The wolves will be in the area now, and we need to leave." "Who? How do you know?" "I don't know who, but I saw their footprints." Kit cursed. She hadn't seen the tracks. Ragland didn't blame her. He'd been hunting and tracking a lot longer than she had. Sweating from exertion, a few more howls to their left alerted Ragland, and so he changed course, making a more northern direction this time. At the top of the valley side, the trees thinned out into an open area of grassland. He could see it ahead, and knew that while it would leave them vulnerable, it would also give them sight of anything or anyone following them. He hoped the latter would be unnecessary, but had a feeling that was wishful thinking. Kit and Ragland broke out from the trees, panting now, and raced across the open ground to its center. They turned on the spot and surveyed the tree line where they had emerged, chests heaving from the effort. "What now?" she breathed, bending over to suck in some air. "We wait a moment. Here." He handed her his bow, taking out the hunting knife on his ankle. "Don't hesitate, and don't notch the second arrow." Kit frowned, strapping his quiver to her own belt. "Huh? Why?" "It will take too long to draw again. Take them in your hand and stab them. They'll be on us before you can get a second shot off." "Oh, great. Shit. That's reassuring, Gramps. You saved my ass from the cannibals just to serve us both to the wolves?" He gritted his teeth. "Not if I can help it." The air grew still. Blood pounded in his ears, and after a few minutes of painful waiting, a single wolf emerged from the trees to their right. Then, on their left, two more. The animals' heads were bowed low, eyes fixed on them. A larger wolf followed, nose raised as it sniffed the air. The alpha. Then 4 more. 7. They were well and truly outnumbered. Ragland felt his stomach drop. This would be more than they could survive. He could no longer hear or taste the salt in his mouth. The world around him was muffled by the adrenaline coursing through his body. He twisted on his heels, grabbing Kit by the arm. "Run!" The jerk of her arm caused her to drop the bow, and she was in no position to retrieve it, having to pump her legs as hard as she could just to keep up with Ragland.
Chased by the wolves, she could hear their ragged breathing gaining on them, imagining their sharp teeth ready to sink into vulnerable flesh.
Ahead, Kit could make out a wooden structure.
It was an old railroad bridge that looked like it had been decommissioned decades ago. She tried to find the breath to tell Ragland, but he had already seen it. "Go! The bridge!" "No shit, Sherlock," she thought. Now, with a destination, they poured on a new burst of speed, but the wolves were eating up the distance quicker than they were closing the gap to the railroad bridge. Ragland knew it would be a close thing. Kit heard wolves yapping barely yards behind her, and she screamed, almost tripping, before running onto the old wooden sleepers. Now sprinting over the dilapidated structure, her eyes widened at a new danger. The wooden beams were creaking under their weight. She could see ahead of Ragland that it crossed all the way over the narrow yet deep gully, but also saw that many of the supports under the bridge, along with a good number of the sleepers on top, had given way years ago. The steel rails were long gone. The drop was enough to kill them both if it gave way. Ragland, who was a few yards ahead of Kit, skidded to a halt and turned with his hunting knife in hand. He moved to the side as Kit flew past him, then stepped back into the path of the huge wolf on her tail and lunged, sweeping the weapon in an upward arc as it leapt at him. The force of his blow embedded the blade to the hilt, but the momentum of the animal sent the wolf sailing over his head. The rickety bridge shook as the shrieking animal landed, then skidded over the edge, taking his hunting knife with it. "No!" The rest of the wolves slowed their charge and cantered cautiously onto the bridge, now wary of Ragland's threat. Kit continued her wobbly run across the bridge, arms out like a circus acrobat. "Good," he thought. "At least saving you from the cannibals won't have been in vain." Deciding the wolves wouldn't delay for too much longer, Ragland took his chances on the bridge and ran after Kit. The wolves gave chase. Ragland yelled for her to keep going. His lungs were on fire, heart pounding in his chest as the wolves gained, snapping and snarling as they got closer. He caught up with Kit. "Keep going," he urged her before he felt sharp teeth clamp down on his calf. The pain was searing. Ragland tripped and knocked Kit over in the process. The combined weight of the wolves, him and Kit hitting the old timber sent up dust and a creaking wooden groan punctuated by 3 ominous cracking sounds. He kicked out at the wolf, still biting and pulling the denim of his jeans, intent on getting to the flesh beneath. It didn't flinch, and its packmates were moving in warily to get their share of the pending kill when the bridge began to tilt to the right. "Run, Kit!" Ragland screamed, his throat raw. "Run!" It was too late. As Kit rose to make an escape, the structure beneath them gave out with an explosive crack. "No!" Ragland dropped, desperately grabbing Kit's ankle, and with his other hand a fractured support beam on the rotten substructure of the bridge. As gravity bit and Kit stopped falling, the sudden weight of her almost wrenched his arm free of his shoulder socket. His cry was louder than the wolves' yelps and squeals as he watched them, along with sleepers and splintered debris from the bridge, plummet into the gully where they were dashed against the rocks and scrub below. Ragland struggled to contain his panic and regulate his breathing. He looked up and saw the baleful yellow eyes of the pack leader eyeing him from the edge of the broken track, sniffing the air, as though weighing up the risk of leaping down onto the narrow beam his erstwhile meal now clung to. Dismissing the wolf as an immediate threat, Ragland peered down at Kit, who had her eyes closed and a splash of blood on her scalp. "Shit," he said. "Hey, Kit, hey! You awake?" Arrgh. His shoulders burned with the strain of holding their combined weight, and he felt his little fingers slip and lose purchase on the beam. Just 3 fingers and a thumb now held him in place, dangling over the huge drop. With a wolf above, certain death below, and Kit hanging unconscious from his rapidly slipping grip, Ragland knew without a doubt that the long streak of luck he'd enjoyed since America fell had finally run out.
Part 2. Bakerstown. Chapter 7. Ragland liked to pride himself in finding solutions to problems. All those years tracking, hunting, and surviving the new world had taught him how to handle most things that came up. Now, hanging 80 feet over a gorge, with the unconscious girl in one hand and the splintered beam in the other, he was finally stumped. Another finger slipped. 3 left. It wouldn't be long now. For a horrible but fleeting moment, he considered letting Kit fall to her death so he could try and save himself. But with epic timing, she spared him that moral dilemma by blinking back to consciousness and beginning to thrash wildly when she found herself hanging upside down over the deep gorge. "Stop! Don't move!" Kit cried, her breath coming in quick bursts as she hyperventilated. The girl waking up spurred him back into survival mode, and he looked around for something, anything, to get them out of their predicament. He found it, 3 feet away. The one remaining support beam that connected both sides of the bridge, one that had run parallel to the broken beam he hung from. It was their only chance. "Hey, Kit, listen to me. Listen," he pleaded. "You see that beam there? That thick piece of wood that spans the gap?" She dared open her eyes and tried to find what Ragland was talking about from her upside-down perspective. "Yeah, I see it. Oh my God. Oh my God." "Good," he said through gritted teeth. "I'm going to need you to work with me here, okay? I'm going to swing you toward it, and I want you to grab it." Kit started to hyperventilate again, and he couldn't blame her. His third finger was cutting into the wood, and blood from it was trickling down to his wrist. I know, but look, if we don't do this, we both die. You got this. Here we go." The wolf above became agitated, perhaps sensing this last-ditch effort at escape, and paced along the edge of the fractured bridge above him, dipping its head and sniffing at the very beam he was going to try and swing Kit to. Ragland clenched his jaw and started slowly building momentum. At first, it felt fruitless, with the wind creating a challenge, but after a few twists, he was creating enough pivot from his shoulder to develop an arc. Kit clawed the air as she gradually swung closer to the beam, her hair dangling beneath her, damp with blood and sweat. "I can't get it," she moaned, her fingers swiping a good 6 inches from the beam. "You can." He gave her another swing and felt his third finger slip right to the edge. The tendons in his wrist popped in protest, and he let out an involuntary cry. This seemed to spook the wolf, which dashed out of sight. This time, Kit's fingertip brushed the edge of the structure before she swung away. I almost got it," she shouted. "One more." Ragland didn't know if he had another. Closing his eyes and biting down hard, he let out a howl, and with all his might threw her, releasing his grip and in the same move reaching up and grabbing his own beam with the newly free hand. Dangling with his eyes closed in dread, he waited for the scream as she fell. Instead, he heard a thud and the sound of Kit scrambling onto the unbroken beam. Looking across and suddenly feeling a hell of a lot lighter, Ragland saw her pull herself up and begin crawling along the beam until she reached safety at the edge of the remaining substructure. From there, she had a quick climb to the surface of the bridge. "Thank God." "You good?" he shouted. "I think so." She bent over, sucking in deep breaths. She looked shaken, and he couldn't blame her. Even though he was free of her weight, he still struggled to pull himself up. His muscles were fatigued and trembled violently. He took a deep breath when he had half crawled onto it, and then carefully got to his feet. Once upright, he dared a glance in the direction of the wolf. It had retreated to the end of the bridge and stood with its sole surviving packmate. But as soon as it saw his head and shoulders peek above the bridge surface, it barked and ran towards him. Staying calm, he leapt across to the other beam. Kit screamed as he teetered with his arms waving wildly before finding his balance and turning towards her.
"Hurry, he's coming!"
"No shit, Sherlock," he thought, as he began speed-walking along the beam with his arms out like a tightrope walker. He heard claws scrabbling behind him as the predator came to a skidding halt. He didn't think it would attempt to jump down onto the narrow beam, but regardless, he awkwardly ran the last 2 yards when he thought he was within range of Kit's outstretched hands. He came in too fast and leapt onto the surface, barreling into her, causing them both to fall to the weathered sleepers. Once he knew he hadn't killed her, he rolled onto his back and began to laugh. It started as a giggle, then turned into a deep belly laugh. Kit joined in too. When the laughter finally subsided, he nursed his left hand and stared up at the sky, which had rapidly fallen into night. Never had the stars looked so beautiful.
"Shit," he panted. "Let's get off this thing, like, right now,"
Kit said, her face still pale. "Yeah, good call." He rolled over onto his side and wearily climbed to his feet. The 2 wolves still watched. He was tempted to flip them the bird, but turned and hastened after Kit, not wanting to tempt fate or linger any longer, in case they plucked up the courage to attempt to jump down onto the beam and follow. It was certainly possible. It was wide enough, and he knew it was only the jump of 5 feet from the surface to the intact beam that was stopping them. They were undoubtedly nimble enough to traverse it. Once safely off the bridge, they both jogged a short distance and fell to the earth. Kit was back up again within seconds to throw up into a bush to the left, hucking up all the turkey she'd eaten earlier. Wiping her mouth with the back of her plaid shirt, she staggered back and fell to her knees next to Ragland, trying in vain to wipe the blood from her forehead.
"That was too close."
"You did good," he breathed, feeling for his gear. "Real good. Ah, shit." He walked back to the edge of the gorge, but darkness had swallowed it, and Ragland couldn't make out the bottom, let alone see if his bow or knife were down there with the dead wolves. God damn it.
"Sorry,"
he heard Kit say behind him, sniffing.
"I didn't mean to drop the bow."
He shook his head, trying not to feel personally wronged, because ever since he rescued her, things had been a hot damn mess. "No," he said, helping her up from the dirt. "Not your fault. We have what we need. Our lives. Besides, I still have the pack. I can replace the bow and knife eventually. For now, we just have to make it to Bakerstown. Know the way?" Kit looked back at the bridge, then surveyed the trees. For a second, he worried she was lost, and that after everything they'd survived, it was all for nothing.
"This way,"
she said finally. "Sure?" Kit nodded.
"I'm sure. We'll reach the hunting lodge first. It's always got someone there for lookout. Probably Peter or Alex."
"And what are these folks of yours like?"
"They're good people, old man. I wouldn't have stayed there if they weren't. So, like, let's just get going. This place is giving me the creeps."
Ragland looked around. He felt it too, like someone was watching. Not wanting to chance their luck any further, they made off into the woods. Luckily, it was a full moonlit night, but they still had to tread carefully to avoid stumbling in the dark. Chapter 8. "Shh," said Kit, stopping and cocking her head after an hour and a half of difficult trekking. Ragland paused behind her, and then heard what she was listening for, the babbling of a stream.
"This way," she said,
and moved off again without checking to see if he was following. The cold night bit at their exposed skin. Both hungry, Kit more so for throwing up everything in her stomach, and exhausted from the ordeal, they staggered down a rocky path between the trees, following the noise of the stream to their right. It sounded closer with every step they took.
"We're here,"
she whispered finally, her feet practically dragging themselves through the dirt. Ragland was about to ask where exactly, but before he could open his mouth, the flickering of torchlight winked at him through the branches. The woodland path opened onto a narrow walkway over the rocky stream that cascaded down from the higher ground to their west. Water always calmed Ragland, the soothing slosh and trickle as it rolled its way over rock and pebble. But not tonight. Instead, despite fatigue, he was on high alert, eyeing the balcony of the big log cabin on the other side of the water. A large man in a cutter's cowboy hat and holding a long rifle at the ready stood at the railing, watching them cross. Kit jogged in front of Ragland, waving her hand.
"Hey, Peter, it's me, Kit."
If he was smart, Ragland thought, he'd have his gun pointed on me within a heartbeat. And he was. No sooner had Kit crossed the short lawn to the decking than Peter swung his rifle up to his shoulder and brought it to bear on Ragland, his feet spread and a cold look on his face.
"That's about far enough." "Peter,"
Kit protested, grabbing her savior's arm.
"His name's Ragland. He saved my life, twice. We owe him. Food and a bed for the night at least." "I'll decide what we do." "Where the hell have you been, girl? We was worried sick. Thought you'd gone and got yourself lost. Me and Alex were fixin' to go looking for you tomorrow." "Peter, please."
Ragland remained stock still on the lodge end of the bridge, his hands up and waiting patiently.
"Toss that bag over here,"
the man ordered, not paying Kit any attention. "Listen, Peter, is it? I'm no bother. I can just leave right now, and we don't—"
"I said, toss the bag. You deaf or just dumb, old man?"
It was all he could do not to groan. This scrawny hero, Peter, looked at least a decade younger than him, with his jeans held up by a too-big belt whose excess length flapped down beside the gun holster on his hip. "You sure I can't persuade you?"
"Throw it here."
Peter clicked back the hammer. Ragland didn't like the look of his trigger discipline, or lack of. He took off his backpack reluctantly and threw it towards the deck. Peter nudged Kit, who stepped down off the veranda and picked up the bag. She looked at Ragland, mouthed sorry, and took it back to Peter, setting it on a wooden table near him.
"Pull up your shirt and give us a turn, princess."
He's not messing around, thought Ragland. This Peter, no matter how young, knew the rules of survival, at least when it came to strangers. Feeling only mildly humiliated, he lifted up his shirt to show no concealed weapons and turned slowly.
"I'm unarmed,"
Ragland shouted when he had done his 360 turn.
"Just give me my gear, and I'll be gone." "No can do."
"Why's that?"
"Don't trust you. This could be some sort of trap or something. You don't get to come any closer. So on your bike and don't come back."
Ragland turned to Kit. "Is this the welcome party you mentioned?"
"Peter," she said, "for God's sake, stop this macho shit right now. No one cares. You've stripped him of everything. Can you at least let him in?"
The young cowboy seemed to think on it. It was clear he wanted to show he was in charge, but a flash of doubt crossed his features in the torchlight. That doubt made him look more like a kid with a button nose trying to play adult than a hardened sentry. Look, Ragland said, his already sore arms aching from being held up too long. I don't know you, and you don't know me. But I figure if word got around in this town of yours that you stripped the guy who saved one of your own before sending him helpless into the woods, it won't earn you any brownie points. You don't have to roll out the red carpet, kid. Just let me take my stuff, and I'll be on my way. I never wanted to get mixed up in this anyway. Kit glowered. He could see the words hurt her, but he'd had enough. This was exactly why he kept to himself and got involved with others as infrequently as possible.
What's going on here?
The woman's voice came from inside the lodge, and a figure emerged. She was shorter than both Kit and Peter, and her voice was soft, but held a tone of authority, not unlike a mother who just found her kids causing trouble. As she stepped into the torchlight, Ragland saw she was a petite woman, much closer in age to him, maybe 27 or so, with sleep-tousled blonde hair. She was wearing a denim shirt under a thick puffer jacket and jeans.
Well?
Ragland's eyes met with hers. In that instant, he knew she was the real boss around here, someone who meant business, and didn't need to point a gun to take control.
He wandered in here with Kit. Don't know who he is, and what with Kit missing and all. Come on, Marley.
The woman named Marley walked over to Kit, putting her arm around her shoulders.
Good to see you back, kid. Want to tell me the story? This old man saved me. Twice. If it wasn't for him, I'd be lunch and dinner for a pack of cannibals a few days' walk from here. Seriously, like I owe him my life. But Peter here is
Marley held up a hand, smiled, and stepped down off the veranda and walked across to Ragland.
What's your name?
Ragland, ma'am. Joshua Ragland.
True, is it? You saved her from them?
Surprised to see her waltz on up to him without a blink of hesitation, he looked down at her and nodded. The height difference was almost comical, and she had to crane her neck up, hand on her hips, to get a good look at him. Yes, that's pretty much how it went down. She regarded him a second longer, then nodded.
I can tell when a man's lying. Peter, she shouted over her shoulder, put that rifle down, you big lump, and go send word to Claire.
Peter hung his head, embarrassed, and skulked off back into the lodge. So, we good then?
Sure. Sorry about him. Peter. He gets awful protective about what we have here. Doesn't take kindly to strangers.
It's no bother. Mind if I get my stuff? She gave him a quick once-over, then nodded. Ragland sidestepped Marley and grabbed his backpack from the table on the veranda. Kit was still there, and she looked on the brink of collapsing. It was after throwing his backpack on that he considered the issue of losing his bow and hunting knife. He'd had both for a very long time and had grown attached to them. He was lucky to still have his pendant. Holding the onyx stone in his hand, he knew in his heart that venturing back out into the wild without a weapon and the means to hunt would be suicide. He needed to stay, regroup, and replenish his energy before figuring out his next moves. Marley joined them, smiling at Kit and rubbing her arm.
When Alex gets here, we'll get you right on over to Claire, okay?
Kit nodded. Given how uncharacteristically quiet she was, Ragland thought she must be on the edge of exhaustion.
Who's Claire?
He asked, adjusting the straps on his bag.
Our town medic.
Ragland's eyes widened. Those aren't too common these days.
We're lucky to have her. Here, let's get inside and start a fire. Alex will be a while yet.
Still on edge and checking shadows, Ragland followed Kit and Marley into the lodge. The interior was, as expected, Dark wood, dusty taxidermy, flags and badges over the walls, and a big old gun over the stone fireplace. A long couch ran for a good 15 feet next to a shaggy rug that had seen better days. Kit slumped onto the lounge, taking up a moth-eaten blanket and tucking her legs in. Poor kid, he thought. Opposite the living area, an island bench that looked like it had been surgically removed from another building entirely and grafted into the lodge, designated the kitchen. He wandered over to the kitchen island, wiping his muddied hand over it. Newer it might be, but it was thick with dust.
"Hey, Sasquatch, want to help me with the fire?"
Marley called to him, bending down to poke the charred remains in the hearth, making room for fresh wood.
"Sure," he said. "What you got?" "Tinder's over in the basket there," she pointed, "and some more logs out on the porch. You get those?"
Ragland smiled. She sure had a way with managing people. She'd known him all of 5 minutes and already had him running around doing errands. His boots echoed across the floorboards on his way to the front door. Next to it, in the half-open drawer of the side table, he could see the rotten covers of old fiction titles and a few magazines. On top there were a few melted candles and a tin dish filled with coins and screws that no one would have a use for ever again. Out on the porch, the cool air ruffled his hair. North-facing, the lodge's front caught most of the weather, feeling substantially colder than the back where they'd entered. To his right was a porch swing covered in leaves, with an old book face down on the seat. To his left, the logs Marley had requested. Grabbing an armful, he returned to Marley, who had cleared a good space, adding plenty of smaller kindling. Ragland knelt, knees clicking, and arranged the logs across each other to maximize oxygen.
"Got a match or a lighter?" "No matches, sorry. We ran out years ago. Same with lighters. You don't have any yourself, do you?"
Marley asked, looking vaguely hopeful. "No, sorry. Flint, then?" Marley picked up a rock and a small piece of flint from the top of the mantelpiece and handed it to him. Ragland took it and noticed the scratches and burns across the rock where it had been used hundreds of times. He'd used matches and lighters in the early years. Then, when they ran out, he'd taken to using flutes of wood and kindling to generate the fire, an old trick he'd picked up from books, but one that played havoc on his hands. It was only after a year that he decided to start collecting flint when he could. It proved to be a game-changer. The shame of it taking him a good year to move to flint still stung on occasion, the calluses on his palms a permanent reminder. "Thank you," he said, striking the flint just twice on the rock, sparks leaping off and catching in the kindling immediately. Orange heat flared and glowed hot. Ragland bent close and blew gently on the kindling, creating a thick plume of gray smoke to fill the space between the logs. He stopped, took a breath, and blew again. The fire took, flames belching into life, curling their hot fingers around the wood. Ragland sat back on his haunches and glanced over at Marley. "Should do." She nodded with a smile. "Not bad, old man." "Hey, I got enough of that from the kid," he said, pointing a thumb at Kit, who was already fast asleep. "For good reason," she said, frowning now as the same light lit up Ragland's face. "You're the oldest person we've seen in a very long time. We thought the virus had killed them off. How old were you when it happened?" 24.
"Wow. Life must be hard out there on your own. You look like you're pushing 40 with that beard. No offense."
Ragland felt exposed. He couldn't remember ever meeting someone so capable of seeing right through him. She was right. The years in the wild had been hard on him. He felt like each year aged him by 3. "I'm gonna go grab some air on the veranda until your guy comes down." Marley grinned.
"Your old bones weary, huh?"
He was, of course, tired and sore from the ordeal over the gorge and the long trek to the lodge, but didn't want to give away just how vulnerable he was. No, just have some thinking to do, is all. Ragland left her to it, glancing over his shoulder to see her watching him, and knowing she didn't buy it. He knew he desperately needed the chance to recover after what had happened. Kit was just mature enough to know when she was beat and needed rest. He could be a stubborn mule at the best of times. Out on the front porch, Ragland went to the swinging bench and picked up the hardcover book, marveling at its pristine condition. Stamped in gold leaf on the black-bound cover was Dubliners by James Joyce. Before he could flick through the pages, a man's voice boomed from the trees in front of the porch. "Best not be losing my place there, sir." Chapter 9. Ragland looked up and saw a tall black man in a dark winter jacket and blue jeans. He had on him a small backpack and a rifle slung across his right shoulder. As he walked closer, he noted stubble on the newcomer's chin and bright, intelligent eyes beneath a Red Sox cap. "No problem," he called back, placing the book down slowly and standing up. Alex stepped up onto the porch, giving Ragland a quick once-over, wearing an expression far more relaxed than his friend Peter had. "You must be the old guy Peter mentioned?" Alex looked no older than 19, maybe 20, which meant, like Kit, he'd spent half of his life in the post-virus apocalypse. Something about the young man's demeanor put Ragland at ease, a relaxing aura he couldn't put his finger on. He gestured to the book. "And you must be the town scholar?" Alex laughed. "Peter didn't say you were funny. But, then again, Peter wouldn't know funny if it bit his ass." He rubbed his stubble, nodding to the door. "They inside?" Ragland nodded. "Kit's resting up." The two men stepped back into the lodge. Marley sat on the edge of the couch with Kit, using a damp cloth to wipe the blood and dirt from her face. Alex took care to be quiet as he put his gear down. "Hey, just got in. What happened?" Marley glanced at Ragland, then placed a hand on Alex's shoulder as he sat opposite, next to Kit's feet. Ragland remained standing by the fireplace, warming his back. "Don't know the full story yet, and I'm not sure what Peter told you. But this man saved Kit from some bad trouble and brought her back to us." Alex looked back at Ragland, a smile brightening up his face. He nodded, then took off his hat. "Thank you." Ragland nodded. Kit stirred at the sound of voices, peeling her eyes open to see Alex. She sat herself up quickly and wrapped her arms around him. Alex did the same, burying his face in her neck before kissing her on the forehead. Marley got up to leave them to it, shoving her hands into her pockets. She walked over to Ragland. "Alex will swap over from Peter for the night watch. We'll walk back with Kit to Bakerstown. I'll get you a bed for the night and feed you breakfast tomorrow. After that, what you do is entirely up to you. But I must emphasize that what you did was a good thing. The town will be thankful for it, and you'll be welcomed. There's enough food to go around, and another pair of hands would go far. So, if you ever—" "I appreciate the offer," Ragland interrupted, averting his gaze from Alex and Kit whispering and kissing each other. "But that's just not me. I'm happy to have helped, but food and shelter will be a fine payment. Really." Marley's eyes studied him again, searching. She stopped, dropping her gaze and placing her hands on her hips. "Very well, Mr. Ragland. Let's get us all back to Bakerstown. Alex, you all set up and good?" Alex was in the middle of softly admonishing Kit. Ragland heard snippets about leaving without warning or backup. He was inclined to agree with the boy, who appeared to have a good head on his shoulders. "Yeah, all good here," said Alex, before standing up, walking over to Ragland, and holding out a hand. "I mean it, thank you. Let me know and I'll repay you in whatever way I can. Don't even mention it, kid. A life is gift enough. I'm serious, name your price. And so am I, no payment needed."
"Kit,"
Marley said, grabbing her own small backpack.
"you think you can manage the hike back into town?"
She nodded.
"Yeah, just a little tired. I'll be all right."
Groggily, she climbed off the couch, throwing aside the blanket, and grabbed a jacket from the clothes peg by the front door. "Hey, one more thing," Alex said to Ragland before he left with Marley and Kit. "Sorry about Peter. He told me he had you at gunpoint. He's always been like that, protective. Go easy on him. The other folks will be happy to see you." Ragland frowned. "How many people know I'm here?" It's not like that. Peter doesn't gossip." "Sure. Thanks, old man. Say, what's your name? I only got your surname." "Joshua. You can call me Josh." Alex smiled, slapping him on the arm. The contact surprised Ragland, the sort of jovial interaction between men that he hadn't experienced in a long time. "All right then, Josh. Good meeting you." The slow walk through the trees, onto a small asphalt road, and up to the wooden gates of what he assumed was Bakerstown, had been more pleasant than he'd anticipated. Cool air, quietness, and the soft chatter between Marley and Kit soothing to his aching head and muscles. The scent of pine hung in the cold air, mingling with the earthy aroma of soil. He snapped off leaves to pick at as he walked, soon appreciating the more level surface of the road that led up to the town entrance. As they approached, Ragland could see the night sky glowed with light from the town. It was clearly bigger than he'd thought, assuming all that light was coming from torches. Ahead, erected to what looked like roughly 20 feet high, stood a timber wall, obviously built to keep strangers out. It was not dissimilar to the barriers and fences around many other towns that he had seen on his travels, although this one was perhaps the most impressive he had seen. It was constructed from big, rough-hewn logs, laid horizontally and strapped together with iron bands. The gates were reinforced with iron plates and looked heavy enough to withstand a battering ram for a good hour or two. At the top of the gates, torches silhouetted two figures with guns pointed down toward their party. Marley walked out in front, waving. "It's Marley. One of y'all go fetch Claire. We've got a couple of injured people to look at." "Open up," boomed one of the voices. The rumbling creak of the gates sounded in the night as they rolled and scraped over the road, two figures pushing them open. "Looks a lot of effort," Ragland remarked. "We had a winch mechanism before," Marley replied. "Long story short, shit happened, and we had to rebuild quickly. It'll do for now." "Fair enough." "We'll get you through to see Claire. Make sure you're all right." "If it's all the same, I think I'll just catch some Z's." She shrugged, already several paces ahead of him. "Suit yourself. Don't expect the marked grave if you die in your sleep." Ragland smiled. Passing through the gates, he looked at the folks standing guard, all eyes on him, the stranger to Bakerstown. They all looked young, much younger than he'd been when he'd gone from his last year of law school to living in the afterdays. And yet their faces spoke of hard experience, the grim reality that one didn't get to choose. It just came knocking at the door and had to be dealt with. Ragland felt a small sadness then, just as he had when he'd seen it before in other kids across the country. Childhoods ripped away from them when the virus took their parents, their friends, their ordinary lives. He didn't see the sadness reflected in those faces, just grit and their will to survive. They might be young, but they weren't to be underestimated.
"Thank you, Rufus."
Marley shouted up onto the wooden walkway that had been built like scaffolding behind the perimeter fence. A skinny white kid with curly hair nodded. Next to him, an Asian kid pointed to Ragland.
"Who's that?" "None of your business, Charlie. Keep the watch. You did ask for it, remember?"
Ragland saw the kid's shoulders slump, but had already moved on. In front of him was the town, similar to any other from the age before America fell, but changed by necessity. The road they walked acted as the main avenue bisecting the town. A big sign proclaimed Main Street. On the left and right, several smaller streets led off from it. Ragland noted that many of the original buildings were still intact, some even refurbished. He concluded from the rough bricks and new mortar that they had a stonemason in their ranks. Not bad, considering that the oldest person he'd seen would only have been 17 at the most during the fall. Even in the dim light, he could tell that some of the wooden structures also looked just a few years old, and there were a lot of them, too. As the trio walked down through the town, deserted due to the time of night, Ragland could see that Kit's hometown was sprawling, full of growth and sustainability. It occurred to him that Marley's offer to stay as a much-needed pair of hands was just kindness. They didn't need him at all. If anything, he'd probably just get in the way. Bakerstown was thriving. Opposite what looked like a converted bookshop, Ragland saw a tall brunette emerge from one of the repurposed shops. Judging by the large red cross above the window, this was the town medic, Claire.
"Hey,"
she said to Marley, smiling at Kit and taking a furtive glance at Ragland.
"Everything okay? Peter and Alex just told me."
"Just a few scratches and bruises, but we should be sure. If you take Kit, I'll get our guest here to his quarters for the night."
"Sure you don't need looking at,"
the doctor offered, looking Ragland over. He held up a hand. "I'm fine. We'll be good as new after a few hours shut-eye."
"Whatever you say, stranger."
She turned to Kit, rubbing her shoulders.
"Hey there. You okay? Let's get you cleaned up."
The doctor led Kit back across the street and into her office, which looked to be lit by a few lanterns. Ragland often wished he'd trained to be an electrician or another useful trade. There was no call for lawyers in post-America, but to be able to work on a plant and revive an electricity grid, even a small one, would have been something exceptional. Instead, they were in the Dark Ages. With such a minuscule number of adult survivors after the fall, lanterns and torches and the occasional small generator would be the best they'd ever have, at least until an industrial rebirth.
"You there?"
Marley called, clicking her fingers.
"Don't fall asleep on me now." That there was Claire. She's an angel. She looks after this town more than anyone, including me.
Claire. Right.
Yeah, sorry, I guess I'm tired. No bother. Let's get you over to the shack. We have a small house at the end here where we put up travelers or people passing through. We call it the Creaky Motel.
Creaky?
It wobbles like a bitch. One of Charlie's first projects. Rahul helped. You'll meet them all tomorrow. They're some of the handymen in town who keep things going.
Right. The two walked down the rest of the avenue in silence, Ragland turning his head left and right to soak it all in. They passed more stores and buildings converted into living space. Some were demolished on the outskirts of town, fenced up and used to grow crops. To the left, a church, and then to the right, what looked to be the original town's school, looked after and, according to Marley, still used for its original purpose. The juxtaposition of original buildings and new wooden structures reminded Ragland they were living and breathing a real American apocalypse. Thrown back into the Wild West, with wooden swing doors, horses as main transport, and canned beans, the new delicacy. "Do you ever miss it?" Ragland said, deciding to break the quiet. "The old world before the virus hit?"
"Sure I do. You know how long it's been since I've seen a meme?"
They both laughed, shaking their heads at the lost technology that used to seem so important. She tapped his arm.
"Not sure I miss all that. But I miss how easy it was. My biggest gripe then was Mom waking me up too early on a Saturday."
He saw a sadness cross her features, and he reminded himself she really was just a kid, too, early 20s at most.
Now it's how to help the town survive another winter without losing another soul. I'm sure you've seen it on your travels. The struggles and harshness of life now. Seems funny that most people back then were more concerned about whether you were a Democrat or a Republican, or the price of gas, or Bitcoin, or Elon's next tweet. I think the virus was more like a time machine than anything else. Took us back a century. But who knows? Maybe that's what we needed.
Ragland liked the analogy. It did feel like getting hurled back in time by an invisible hand and waking up living in an old Western movie. Elon Musk. I haven't heard that name in years. You know, I heard a rumor about a year after from someone that he lifted off from Mars in one of his rockets a week before the attack. It was all on the hush-hush, of course. Just him, his family, and a select group of scientists.
No. Bullshit.
You know, it probably is bullshit. But a tiny piece of me hopes it's true, that he got to live out his dream. They both looked up at the stars and were silent for a minute, contemplating the possibility it was true.
"What about you?" she asked. "You miss it?"
His hand touching the onyx stone on his chest didn't go unnoticed by Marley. "A few things, sure. Certainly took electricity for granted, didn't we?"
"Sure as hell did. Though I heard a rumor last year of folks a state over trying to rebuild a plant and learn how to run it."
"Really?"
"Hell yeah. It's not over for us yet, Mr. Ragland."
They had finally arrived at a run-down-looking shack with a front door and no windows. Scrawled in white paint above the door was Creaky Motel. A big old Coca-Cola sign, made from tin and spotted with rust, was nailed to the wall. Ragland wasn't sure it was there purely for decoration. "Thank you," he said, opening the door to peek in. It was bare, with only a fireplace, a bed, and a chest of drawers on the opposite side. A small fire was crackling away in the fireplace.
"You're welcome. Had Peter come by and set it up for us."
"How'd you know I'd stay?" Marley smiled, giving him a wink.
"You'll get to know my ways. Sleep tight now. Come by the square at sunup. I'll introduce you to the town and organize you some breakfast."
"Sure thing," he said, nodding. "And call me Josh." She returned the nod and pulled the door closed. The weary drifter stowed what little he had left, then collapsed onto the bed, asleep almost as soon as his head hit the pillow. Chapter 10. 3 loud gunshots ripped Ragland from a deep sleep. He bolted upright, the room dark, feeling for the hunting knife he'd lost the day before. He was still getting his bearings when the bangs came again. No, not gunshots. It was some damn fool rapping on the tin Coca-Cola sign next to the door. He climbed off the battered mattress, rubbing his back, and realized just how cold it was with the fire out. Grumbling, he staggered over and pulled the door open. Kit, patched up and in fresh clothes, stood with her arms folded.
"You been sleeping this whole time?"
Ragland squinted up at the cloudy sky.
"What time is it?" "Time you got dressed, old man. Here." She bent and picked up a bag she'd left on the steps and flung it into his arms. "Fresh clothes, towel, homemade soap. There's a shower behind this shack."
Shower?"
Kit smirked. "Well, more like a bucket. I'm sure it'll be an upgrade from bathing in rivers, though. It'll be cold. We don't heat water for bathing until it gets to winter, just to conserve our resources."
Ragland nodded. "Makes sense. Listen, about yesterday. You doing okay? It was a hell of a getaway."
"Yeah," she said, fidgeting with her jacket sleeve. "Claire checked me over. Nothing major, so, I guess I'm invincible, or whatever. Anyway, I just swung by to wake your ass up and give you the clothes. Marley's expecting you in the square, so I'd hurry up if I were you. She hates tardiness."
"Roger that." She was right. The water was cold. He took an old dishcloth from the bag and used it with the soap to wash off the worst of it. Not knowing how full the tank was, he hurried himself up. It took vigorous scrubbing to shift the dirt and blood from his travels, especially his matted hair. He'd turned half wild. Feeling rejuvenated from his baptism, he rummaged through the clothes and pulled out a pair of black jeans, a white t-shirt, socks, and some underwear. Pulling them on, the jeans were a little loose, but otherwise everything fit. Ragland smiled to himself as he pulled the socks on. That Marley knew how to measure by the eye, that's for sure. With no mirror to check, he swiped his fingers through his long hair and beard, hoping for the best. He grabbed his old jacket, which was still dirty, and took it with him on his walk to find the town square. Bakerstown looked very different in the daylight. The streets were filled with people coming and going, most busy with tasks or errands, by the looks of it. Men, women, and children delivering everything. Long pieces of timber for the houses, wagons filled with water tanks, horses strapped with tools for the workers, and others loaded with fresh produce. Spying the wicker baskets, Ragland had a hunch they'd be heading to a town square to share out the crop. He'd seen similar behaviors in other smaller towns and villages before. It seemed at the end of the world communities gravitated toward socialism in the real sense of the word. Backpack over one shoulder, Ragland followed the two kids up the side street, getting constant side glances and looks from the locals. A few stopped their DIY projects or paused their chatter, eyes searching and studying. "Don't worry," he thought. "I won't be here for long." The kids rounded left onto another road, where horses and wagons were running back and forth with goods and equipment. It felt eerily like stepping back to a time well before the virus. Civilization here in Bakerstown was thriving in a symphony of trade and primitive industry. Navigating the horses, earning a few more stares, Ragland continued his tale of the two kids as they turned onto another side street. It opened up onto Main Street. This section saw the road widening for what had once been on-street parking opposite the town hall. Now the entire area had been repurposed as a market, with rudimentary stands and tables laid out in a semicircle. Ragland could smell the food from a mile away, lifting his head to catch every last scent. He closed his eyes and listed everything. Earthy potatoes, apples, peaches, cabbage, beans, tomatoes, and even cherries. "Can I help you?" Ragland peeled open his eyes and looked down to his right. A kid no older than 8, with scruffy brown hair and big eyes, gawked at him with a single eyebrow raised. The drifter smiled. "Hey, kid." "I'm no kid, jerkface. You're not from here, are you?" "You got that right." He turned to survey the market. No one had noticed a stranger talking to one of their own just yet. Everyone was too engrossed with handing out the food. It looked to Ragland like they'd formed a rudimentary system of bartering. "Know who Marley is, kid?" "My name's Jackson, not Kid. Don't call me that. Call me Jackson."
Everyone knows Marley, jerkface. Ragland held up his hands in mock offense. Hey, now, I'm just asking where she is. She's right here. A familiar voice spoke from Ragland's left. He turned to see Marley standing hands on hips and glaring at Jackson. Now, what have I told you, Jackson, about calling people jerkface? It's not nice, is it? What would your mom and pa say, huh? The kid looked abashed, looked sideways at Ragland, and started chewing something in his mouth. Sorry. Been called worse. Don't worry about it, kid. Jackson. Marley flapped a hand. Git. Erica will be wondering where you're at. Without another word, the kid bolted, sprinting up the street. Marley turned to Ragland, smiling. She tucked some loose hair behind her ear, giving him the once-over. I see you found the shower. Anyway, I promised you a tour. Have you eaten yet? No, ma'am, he found himself saying, which made her laugh. We can nip that in the bud right away, old man. I'm not your ma'am. Call me Marley. The kids call me Mayor Marley for fun. Whatever gives you your kicks, I guess. Marley it is. Let's get you fed, then. Simon will have some oats ready for you. Marley was straight into the action, saying goodbye to a few of the folks at the market and waving at others as she turned back toward the avenue. For a short person, she sure had a stride on her. Ragland had to focus to keep up. That right there's the florist. Casey and Fred run that. A florist? She laughed. I'm guessing you're wondering why we'd need one, right? Low on the priorities? Well, Bakerstown doesn't just exist for function. Not anymore. We saw the value in the little extras. Keeps morale up and offers more purpose to our lives than turning over human waste for fertilizer and digging up crops. He wasn't convinced. The land around them was their garden. A florist shop felt tacked on and unnecessary. But what did he know about running a town? Sure. Don't you get all grumpy on me again, old man. I'm sure some honey oats will flip that frown of yours. Honey? He found himself asking. Oh, yeah. We do all right, us Bakerstown folk. Their tour to wherever Simon was located led conveniently through most of the settlement. It allowed Marley to stretch her legs and introduce Ragland to what felt like half the population. Not far from the florist was an old civil building. They were in time to see a tall, shaven-haired woman with tattoos and glasses carrying a load of books through the main entrance. That's Jenny, Marley said. She's the town librarian and chronologist. She makes sure we keep record of everything, that we don't lose our little bits of history. As you know, with the virus wiping out the adult population, well, except for you apparently, there was no one to keep the power on, let alone servers or computers running. So we're back to paper. Jenny keeps us from going all the way back to the Dark Ages. Next up, outside the refurbished school, a chunky-looking man, also wearing glasses, was theatrically gesticulating in front of a group of young kids sitting cross-legged on the lawn outside the building. That's one of our teachers, Clint. His parents, before the virus, were teachers. He's a quiet one. Stoic, you would say. A bit like you. But when he's around kids, he lights up. He has near boundless amounts of energy, too. He and Erica, who I mentioned earlier, are the two in Bakerstown who help educate the next generation. The next generation? Sure. Claire has helped deliver quite a few little sprites since the fall. Oh. We lost a few, too, but... Marley's pause was a stab of melancholy in their otherwise enjoyable introduction to the Bakerstown people. He was still dwelling on it by the time they reached Simon's Cafe and Bar. Here we are, she said, waving at the sign. Wow. A lot of work had been done to the building in front of Ragland. Peering closer at it, he could see from some of the base brickwork that it had once been two buildings, a separate bar and the smaller cafe next to it.
But now supports had been placed and the middle wall knocked through with a serving window. From the kitchen there was a direct view into the bar, and vice versa. Ragland crossed his arms, nodding his head slowly in admiration. Nice handiwork there.
Sure is. Charlie helped Rahul with the project when he was just 15 years old. Hell of a kid. You saw him when you came in last night. You haven't met Rahul yet. He's the local blacksmith, as if this place isn't quite Wild West enough for you.
All that's missing is a saloon and hitching posts, he laughed.
Anyway, she clapped, I have to go. Hey, Cy, got a new one here. Give him a bowl or two of your best honey oats, okay? Don't want our reputation slipping.
Simon, a red-haired man almost as tall as Ragland, with a long ginger beard and thick arms, waved Ragland in.
Sure thing, Marley.
Marley winked, already speed-walking back the way she came. Ragland, shifting the backpack on his shoulder, ducked into the cafe side of the building, breathing in the fresh smell of hot oats and the sweet tang of honey in the air. It smelled so good. Stomach growling, he ambled over toward the counter, where Simon gave him a polite smile.
So, you're new to Bakerstown, eh? What's your name?
His Canadian accent was strong, soft with a musical tone to it. Despite his size, Ragland felt Simon was someone who wouldn't cause him any trouble. I'm not staying long. Listen, I need new gear. I lost my knife and bow out there and need to trade to get something new. Tell me where I can go, and I'll get out of your hair as quick as I can.
The hell you will, hoser,
Simon barked from behind his great beard.
What did you call me?
Listen, Marley tells me I gotta feed you, so I do as I'm told, and you sit yourself down and relax and eat. Then we can talk. Ragland shook his head with a grimace. Is everyone so stubborn in this goddamned place? Welcome to Bakerstown, old man. Finest hot oats and the stubbornest people you ever did meet. Here. Simon slopped a ladle full of porridge into a bowl, then topped it off with a generous spoonful of honey. It was the first fresh batch of the stuff Ragland had seen in years. Plenty of settlements didn't bother with the luxury, preferring to keep away from bees. He didn't blame them. Ragland sat at the counter and took the bowl and spoon. Thank you. The bearded Canadian threw a towel over his shoulder and leaned over the counter, peering at him. Ragland wasn't fond of being watched and felt himself bristle. What? I want a verdict. His patience was wearing thin, but he humored the guy because he just wanted to eat and get moving. He took a decent spoonful and put it into his mouth. Then it hit him. Jesus, he whispered, refilling his spoon and taking another mouthful. Simon crossed his arms. You're welcome. Have I at least earned your name now? His eyes half-lidded in pleasure. Ragland swallowed his third spoonful of oats and nodded. Joshua Ragland. Surnames too, huh? Well, pleased to meet you, Joshua Ragland. I'm Simon Tremblay. Chapter 11. By the afternoon, Ragland had met with more of the people in town and had returned to Simon's for lunch. Simon had been happy to serve him the spicy bean casserole now that they were on a first-name basis. One of the other townspeople who had impressed him was the town butcher, who supplied their very limited stock of fresh meat. His name was Jack, a Scottish lad who had come over with his family before the virus hit. He had been stranded in the States ever since, and Marley had given him a home, she told him on their continued tour, because he had no one else left. His father was a butcher, and Jack had been helping out in the store since he was 10. He's been a godsend. We keep our dependency low. Hunt enough to offer it to the town a few times a week. Seems a good kid, Ragland muttered. Hunting and butchering is a key skill. Sure is. I hear you're a dab hand yourself, old man. Ragland smirked. Kid? Yep,
Spoke with her after I left you with Simon. She's doing well and back to helping Erica with the kids at school."
"Great." He could still feel the stares of the locals, little itches at the back of his head. Then, when he turned, the low murmur of suspicion. It was the one thing he hated most when passing through settlements. He would always be a stranger to them, a wanderer, a drifter. Being alone was in his blood. He liked to help where he could, but Ragland always made sure to draw back into his own world when enough was done. Already he'd allowed himself too many comforts: honey oats, beans, a shower. It was time to go. "Listen, I've stayed too long as it is. I need to replace my gear. Do you have somewhere I could—" Marley nodded. "Why don't we pay Rahul a visit?" On the edge of the town, beside an open plot of unused land, a large double-door garage belched heat. Inside, Ragland could make out workshop benches, an anvil, a furnace rigged to the roof to remove the smoke, and endless rows of shelving filled with tools and equipment. Like a thin veneer, charcoal dust and filth coated the floor and walls. By the anvil, a big man in an apron and large protective glasses pulled back his tinted face shield, revealing eyes that were such a deep brown they were almost black, and a bushy black mustache. The man drilled him with an intense stare that he returned in kind. Neither man dropped their gaze, and Rahul finally jabbed the hammer toward him. "Who's the asshole, Mayor?" "This is Ragland, the asshole who saved Kit from a pack of cannibals 2 days' walk from here," she said, marching up to him and crossing her arms. "How are the nails coming along?" Rahul finally let his eyes stray from Ragland. "Good. Managed to smelt some struts off an old pylon out east, which will give us another few hundred or so." Marley nodded. "Good. Listen, our friend here is looking to part ways, as much as it pains me." She emphasized the last 2 words, glancing at Ragland. "But he lost his gear getting Kit back to us. And it's my problem how." "Jesus, Rahul. I make stuff for the town, Mayor. I don't pawn my shit off to out-of-towners. That ain't how it works." "Well," she said, pointing a finger at the blacksmith's chest, "we owe him, and we always pay our due. So what will it be? You gonna brood, or are you gonna fetch this fine hero a hunting knife so he doesn't starve by sundown?" Rahul's eyes narrowed. He worked his jaw, a lot like Peter had when he leveled the rifle at him back at the lodge. Finally, he huffed and stalked off and through an adjacent door. The pair heard banging and clanging, Marley giving Ragland a wink, before the smith returned, holding what looked to be a 7 or 8-inch blade in one hand and a leather sheath in the other. "Here," Rahul grumbled, sliding the knife home and shoving it toward Ragland. "Wasn't so hard, was it?" Marley said, shaking her head. "A word?" Rahul snapped. The pair stepped away from Ragland. They got into it, their hands gesticulating and their voices rising enough for him to catch a few words about limited resources and helping strangers. Marley returned with a glint in her eyes. "Shall we go?" "All good, then?" "Yeah," she said. Ragland watched the sour Rahul pull his visor down and go back to work, reheating the rod he'd been working on when they arrived. "Listen, you mind if I say goodbye to the kid?" "Kid?" "Yeah. It wouldn't be right if I just left." Marley smiled, inclining her head. "No, it wouldn't. Come on now." Chapter 12. Kit stepped away from the group of young kids after placing a crayon and piece of paper next to them. Her expression clearly painted her disappointment in the news. "When are you leaving?" "Now. I've just restocked. Marley helped me out with a knife and some food for the road.
What about your bow? Isn't that like key for hunting or whatever?
I'll manage with traps for now. I've done it before. The classroom Ragland and Marley had interrupted proved too loud for conversations to continue, so the three stepped outside into the cool, crisp air that was signaling a turn toward winter.
Why not stay until spring when it gets warmer? She said, rubbing her upper arms. The weather will only get worse. Can't imagine how friggin' cold it gets out there, you know? And you're no young buck neither, right?
I'll be just fine. Looking uncomfortable, perhaps sensing that trauma had created a certain bond between the two, Marley cleared her throat.
I'll leave you two to say your goodbyes. Mr. Ragland, I'll be at the gate.
He nodded. After she'd walked a good distance away, Kit fired up, detailing all the idiotic consequences of his decisions and why it made more sense to stay, even if it was for the short term.
You're being such an ass, you know that? No, a jerk face, as Jackson would say. A friggin' jerk face.
Listen, you wouldn't understand. Besides, I've gotten you home safe, like I promised. There's nothing more I can do for you or this town.
Maybe there's something we can do for you.
Ragland wasn't getting through to her, and didn't like how her attitude echoed that of his sister when they argued. It made biting back that much harder. Damn it, kid, I'm going. I came to say goodbye out of courtesy. He turned to leave, but Kit stopped him in his tracks with her next words.
Would she want you to be out there in the world alone?
What did you say?
Your sister, Kit said. I think she'd want you to make a home, you know?
He spun and crossed the space between them in a flash. You don't know a goddamn thing about her. Just because I saved your life doesn't mean you get to talk to me like that. I don't owe you a damn thing. Kit's eyes welled up.
Asshole.
Their shouting had alerted one of the teachers inside. A woman poked her head out the door.
Everything okay, Kit? Yeah,
she said, wiping her eyes and stepping away from Ragland.
All good here, Erica. Just, saying goodbye, you know?
She looked back to Ragland, a look of betrayal and hurt on her face.
Have a nice life.
And then she was gone, leaving Ragland alone in the street, with more eyes on him. Now itching to leave, guilt for his harsh words a mighty motivator, Ragland speed-walked the quarter-mile to the gate, where he saw Marley with a few faces he didn't recognize, and one he did. Alex, Kit's boyfriend. Marley's arm went up when she spotted Ragland approaching, and the guards began to push the gate open.
You sure about this?
She asked one last time.
You know you're welcome to stay, so long as you pull your weight. Offer's still on the table, old man.
Ragland sighed, which Marley decoded within a heartbeat.
Guessing she didn't take it too well, huh?
No, he replied, searching the tree line outside the perimeter. She did not. Alex overheard. Everything okay? Marley rested a hand on his shoulder.
Everything's fine. You get to sleep. You've earned it after that watch.
The young kid eyed Ragland. What did you say to her? Nothing.
Don't lie to me. Kit doesn't upset easy, and I'm not stupid.
Ragland shifted the backpack on his shoulders, threading his left arm through and clicking in the straps. He made sure the knife on his hip was secured properly. He had already checked the blade and couldn't help admiring the work Rahul had done on the weapon. It would serve him well. He couldn't find the words to answer Alex. Instead, Marley found them for him.
Go see her then, Alex. She's just upset that Mr. Ragland has to leave. A visit from her boyfriend will cheer her up.
Yeah, I think I will, Alex said, then looked back at Ragland and held out his hand. "I know my manners. Thank you again for bringing Kit back to us. Whatever you two said is between you, but if you upset her, well then, maybe don't come back." Ragland nodded, his first impression that he was a loyal, good-hearted kid reinforced. "Sure thing, Kit," he said, before turning to Marley. "Thanks for everything, Mayor Marley."
"Any time."
Ragland glanced back to see them watching him as the guards pulled the gates closed. When they snapped shut, he filled his lungs with the cool, pine-scented air. It had only been 12 hours at most, but he'd missed it all the same. In just a day, Ragland managed a modest 5-mile hike south from Bakerstown before making camp. In the morning, he intended to head east to the coast before heading south for winter. He got to test the efficacy of his newly acquired hunting knife, clean and sharp. It made quick work of a raccoon he'd been lucky enough to trap. I suppose it wasn't all for nothing, he mused as he worked. But still, he wished he hadn't lost his bow. It'd take him some time to replace it. He'd need to either make a replacement or travel into a ghost town or city to try and find one. For now, he'd stick to traps and the knife. The campfire had been quicker to light, too, the sharp blades sparking the tinder in one go. The fire snapped and popped as Ragland held a piece of his small game over the flames, staring into the fire.
"Would she want you to be out there in the world alone?"
Kit's words swirled in his mind, bringing back regrets and memories. The smell of charred meat jerked him back to the present. Ragland swore, pulling the meat up and inspecting the damage. Half of it was blackened beyond saving, so he took the knife and sliced it in half, chewing on the rest. Above, shifting and winking around and through the plume of wood smoke, the stars of the cold night drew his attention. Ragland leaned back on his elbows and squinted at them, his eyes adjusting to the dark around him.
"I think she'd want you to make a home, you know?"
He threw the last bit of gristle into the trees, angry at the tormenting thoughts. The kid didn't know shit. She'd known him for a day or two, not long enough to unpack a decade of grief and regret. Ragland was away in his head, the camp still not fully set up, when he heard the scuffle of feet behind him. He had no time to react before a bony arm wrapped around his neck. Cursing, Ragland clutched the arm, leaned forward, and then threw his head back as hard as he could. It was like hitting rock, but he was rewarded with the muffled crunch of a nose breaking and a shriek that almost burst his eardrums. As warm blood gushed onto the back of his head, the arm loosened and he scrambled away. He rose to his feet and turned to confront his attacker. It was a cannibal, clearly a Zom, half-dressed, almost more creature than man, with blackened teeth, long fingernails, and blood-stained lips. Slowly, it rose from where it had fallen. Ragland's mouth dropped. It didn't seem possible. The bastard was huge, at least 6'6". As he scrambled frantically for his new hunting knife, the creature leapt at him, knocking him to the ground, and began trying to claw his face and throat. Suffocating under the immense weight and wretched stench that filled his nose, Ragland desperately felt the ground around him until his fingers happened upon the handle of the knife. He gripped it just as the cannibal bit down hard on his ear. Ragland screamed and warm blood oozed down the side of his face. He could feel it slicking his neck. Wasting no time, he thrust the knife up into the Zom's throat. He gave the blade a quick jerk to the right, and a waterfall of blood gushed from the seam, drenching him. The cannibal, eyes wide in shock, twitched, gurgled, then flopped backwards, clutching frantically at the mortal wound. Panting, Ragland sat up, watching it die, then heard the distant cry of more of them in the night. A branch snapped behind him, and he turned, holding his knife out in front of him, only to find a familiar face illuminated eerily by the glow of the campfire. "Let's get you the hell out of here, old man," said Alex from Bakerstown. Part 3. The Bad Penny. Chapter 13. "Open the gates!" Alex roared up to Charlie, who vanished behind the fence, then reappeared moments later, pushing open the entrance to Bakerstown. It would be the second time in 3 days that Ragland would enter the settlement in the dead of night, covered in blood. "Better be careful or I'll start to make a name for myself," he thought. Alex and Ragland marched through, helping Charlie shut the gates immediately, the crack of wood snapping to with a satisfying echo through the square. Charlie, the young guard Ragland remembered from before, stared at him with wide eyes. He must have looked like a horror show. "It's not ours," Alex spoke for them, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "Well, not mine, at least." The pair had jogged nearly the entire distance back to Bakerstown and hadn't encountered any more cannibals. Ragland wiped the blood from his neck. It coated his hand like a slick red grease. "We might have a problem." "Yeah, you'd think?" Alex replied. Charlie turned his head between the two large men, pointing to Ragland's bandaged ear. "What happened out there?" "Never you mind, kid," Ragland growled. "I'm no kid." "The hell you aren't." Alex shook his head. "Charlie, we need you back on watch. We need to go speak to Marley." "But what, Charlie?" Alex's hard look seemed to encourage Charlie's reconsideration of protest. Huffing, he mumbled something under his breath and climbed back up onto the walkway, glancing down briefly at the two. "Come on," Alex said, tapping Ragland on the arm. "We need to go see her now." Just like before, barely a voice stirred in the night. It had been too long since Ragland kept a timepiece on his person, but he figured the hour was late enough that visiting Marley meant waking her up. "Listen, kid, we can catch her up in the morning." "No," Alex said, his stride almost a match for Ragland's as they marched through town, taking a few turns toward an area that looked to be more residential. "We can't." "What does that mean?" "It means we may have a bigger problem on our hands than you think we do, old man. It means we got to tell Marley ASAP." Ragland grabbed Alex by the arm and whirled him to a stop. The pair stood shrouded almost entirely in darkness beside a large stone building that must have once been a series of department stores. "What do you mean, a bigger problem?" Alex shifted. "The cannibals. They've always been a problem. Not like this." Ragland ran his fingers through his hair. "Only forever." "I know what a fucking cannibal is, old man. Don't preach to me like I don't." "Oh, that right?" "They have leaders, order, even a government. They send out feral packs like scouts, rangers, looking for the most vulnerable settlements and people. People like us. Meat. Then the others move in force, more organized, more deadly." Ragland bit the inside of his cheek to avoid his face telling too much. Truth is, he had been away from people a long time. There were gaps in his knowledge. "You're not kidding, are you?" "No, I'm not. This is the closest I've seen them, which is why we need to get to Marley." On the edge of Bakerstown, an old 3-story house stood first in a neat row of others that looked identical, although more ramshackle. The garage, lot size, and the windowed loft on the home informed Ragland that it likely belonged to someone quite well off. "Wow." "Yeah," Alex said, wasting no time to indulge and stomping right up the main path to the front door. Inside, in the top window, a light flickered to life. Shadows of candlelight danced across the ceiling. Ragland heard a staircase creaking underfoot a second or two before Marley threw the door open, her irritated gaze falling on Alex.
Where in hell have you been?
Her face softened immediately upon seeing Ragland, covered in blood and with a bandaged ear.
Well now, what's this mess?
Cannibals, Alex said, gesticulating urgently and stepping in front of Ragland. More of them and closer than usual. I think we've got a problem.
Hang on, Ragland said. There was only the one. Only the one that we saw. You heard them, too. Marley, Ragland said, I'm sorry for the intrusion. Alex here has himself all worked up.
Alex raised his voice, and a few more lights flickered on in the houses opposite.
I'm not exaggerating. We have a problem, Marley, a big problem. We need to talk. Can this wait until tomorrow? She said, rubbing her eyes. No, it really can't.
Ragland stood silent, not quite believing the discussion unfolding before his eyes. It had only taken him 2 days to stumble back into people drama. 2 damn days. Marley patted down her bed hair and looked up and down the street.
You best come on in, then, before we wake the whole town up with this racket. Come on now.
The mayor led them into the open hallway, Ragland closing the door behind them. Marley picked up the candle she'd placed on the stand behind the door before she'd opened it.
This way, she said.
Alex and Ragland followed wordlessly, the soles of their boots drumming on the wooden floorboards. She guided them down the hallway and left into a small room. The walls were lined with bookshelves, leaving space at the end for a window. In the middle sat a long table with coasters haphazardly placed on it. Marley pulled out 2 seats, then walked around to the other side and sat down opposite. A hand motioned for them to do the same. Ragland caught the smell of printed paper as he navigated the table, placing his backpack down beside his feet before sitting in the chair next to Alex. Marley placed the candle on the table, casting an eerie glow over her features.
From the beginning. Tell me what happened. Alex, you go. We'll get to you last, old man.
Chapter 14. Alex began to explain how he had left to follow Ragland later on the day he had departed. A lot of the story came as a surprise to the drifter, and he was annoyed at being tracked without his knowledge, and worse, that the kid had seemed to track him with ease. Still, he gritted his teeth and listened. The tale continued until it reached a point Ragland hadn't foreseen. Alex had been distracted by smoke in the southeast and had briefly veered from Ragland's trail to investigate. Half a day in that direction, he had come across a big encampment. Turning back, he decided to catch up with Ragland and let him know he had been tracking him and warn him about the danger to the south. He arrived just in time to see Ragland deal with the surprise attacker, a lone cannibal. "A scout," Alex said, leaning forward. "I think they were hunting for whoever had taken down their gang when they didn't come back." Marley didn't make a move once he'd finished, but hadn't beckoned Ragland to tell his side of events either.
"What did you take with you?"
she asked after a pause. Alex frowned.
"What?" "I'm asking, what provisions did you take with you on your little adventure?"
I took just a tin or two. Some wood, flint, other things."
"Supplies for how long?"
Alex didn't speak right away, causing Marley to erupt.
"I said for how long?"
Ragland looked at her, his eyes widening a little. 4 days, Alex said, sinking into his chair. Marley put her face in her hands.
"You stole rations and equipment without sign-off. Do you know what sort of crime you've committed? And for what? For the right reasons," he protested.
Ragland decided to jump in. "Listen, Marley, maybe cut the kid some slack. I think he got a little scared from the incident with Kit."
"I'll give him something to be scared about," she said, pointing a finger. "You've betrayed my trust, Alex. I gave you that job as head watch on your promise to me. What was important enough to make it worth breaking, huh?" The teenager placed his hands on the table, eyes searching Marley's. Ragland saw pain there, clear remorse for his actions. "We all know about cannibals, Marley. But it's been a long time. Most won't see the danger. Some of the younger ones refuse to believe they exist at all. But you and I know. I had a feeling that after Ragland killed their crew, they might come back looking for revenge." Alex wiped his nose. "This man saved her life. I love Kit, more than anything. I couldn't just watch him go like that, because something in my gut told me they'd be hunting for him." Ragland looked at Alex. It had been many years since he'd been on the end of such a selfless act. The last one, in fact, had saved his life. This one, no doubt, avoiding further trouble altogether. Maybe the kid was right. It wasn't unreasonable to assume that they were hunting whoever they thought responsible for the murder of their gang. Marley shook her head. "Sweet Jesus, Alex. I'm sorry, Marley. I really am." She ignored him, turning to Ragland. "Much of what he said true?" "I think so, from what I saw. Either I got very unlucky, or it's possible they were hunting." Marley got up from her chair and started pacing back and forth, her petite form vanishing and reappearing in the dim light. "How? How could they have hunted you? Didn't you tell us you killed them all? Kit confirmed it." "I did," Ragland agreed, lacing his fingers. "I have a theory. It's not a nice one, but maybe Alex here can build on it." "Oh?" she asked. Alex frowned at Ragland. "What is it?" "These cannibals. You mentioned that in these parts they've grown organized. Care to expand on that?" "I can jump in there, cowboy," Marley interrupted, holding a hand up to Alex. "Back in the early years after the fall, this area had been lucky. Just on the other side, and even along the Appalachian Ridge, fights went on every day. Factions and gangs of kids digging in their heels. It quietened down eventually. Many of those who survived starved or got sick and died. A small band of us were from Bakerstown. Me, Claire, and Rahul are the founders of what you see now, I guess. We lived here before and got together to defend it from those who wanted to take what wasn't theirs, but also to welcome those who needed refuge. Eventually, we started to hear about a gang who were snatching people near the woods, killing and butchering them while they slept by their campfires, that sort of thing. It was hell. For a while, we were terrified to leave this place. It was then we decided to fortify, and within a few years we were completely barricaded from the outside world." "Like it is now?" Ragland asked. Marley shook her head, licking her lower lip. "Not quite. A year after the wall went up, we lost a lot of good folk." "They came," Alex interrupted, his eyes haunted in the low light. "The cannibals stormed the gates, tearing them down. It was all we could do to hold them back." "We weren't combat trained," Marley continued for him. "But their numbers were smaller than they are now, and they were driven mostly by a shared hunger and desperation, and we got the best of them. Not before we lost a lot of our own, though." "How does this story factor into what's happening now?" Ragland asked. "With what Alex has said, they grew in numbers and got organized?" Marley nodded. "That's what we have heard and guessed. We've not seen many since. Only rumors of sightings now and then from traders, but always a long way from us." "But you have your suspicions that they're growing?" Ragland asked. "Yes, some of us." Ragland raised an eyebrow. As he did, the tightened skin pulled at the wound on his ear.
The wet ooze of blood dribbled down his neck. A souvenir. Some.
Just a year ago, Alex here decided to gate crash the local town meeting. He mentioned everything we have tonight, but topped it off with a cherry most couldn't stomach to swallow, let alone bite.
What does that mean? Ragland turned to Alex, who had sunken further into his seat. I suggested that the cannibals had developed a sort of society to rival our own. That they weren't all just dumb eating machines like the feral ones, and that there were smart ones in charge and that we should prepare for them if they ever came our way. He held up his hands as Marley shook her head. Ragland listened with interest. Clearly they hadn't heard of norms and zoms, but the kid had nailed it without knowing the titles they'd been given in other states. Still, the term society was a stretch. More like a few loose and scattered communities from what he'd seen and heard. So, have you seen it with your own eyes? He asked, wanting to ascertain how the kid had come to this conclusion about the two tiers. I have, once. The bastard smiled at me from a distance. I was out one day checking the ridge with an old pair of binoculars. I could make out his face, behind the smeared blood. Tattoos all down his body. He had one of the feral ones on a leash and winked at me. Winked? Yeah, he said. Winked. That would have been a norm. Oh, what? The drifter went on to explain about norms and zoms, and told them he had rarely seen a gathering of them larger than 5. Doesn't mean Alex isn't right about larger groups. I've just never seen it myself. The two locals digested that information for a minute before Marley clapped her hands.
All right. That's enough for one night, boys. Alex, go home and get some sleep. Now you, sir, the creaky is still free if you want to stay the night, but make sure you shower before you bloody up the sheets.
Actually, I might need to see Claire. Ragland peeled back the bandage to reveal the bite wound on his ear. Marley winced.
Well, I guess I can forego any further sleep then, she barked,
marching with speed from the room, leaving Alex and Ragland in her wake. Chapter 15. The town doctor, Claire, was rubbing her eyes as she opened the door to her offices. Marley simply gestured to Ragland, and when she saw the state of him by the candlelight, Claire made a low hissing sound.
You're back. You're like a bad penny. Not going to make this a habit, right?
I don't plan to, no.
Thanks, Claire. I'm going back to bed,
said Marley.
I take it you remember where the creaky is, Mr. Ragland?
Sure do. Thanks again. Ragland followed Claire through the waiting room to her office. He noticed that aside from the absence of leaflets and computers, everything still looked remarkably similar to the way a family doctor's did in the days before the fall. Place looks good, he said.
It wasn't always like this,
she said, closing the door behind him.
Sit.
Yes, ma'am. Claire tied her hair back in a ponytail, frowning at Ragland.
Don't ma'am me.
Okay, he said, forgiving her abruptness. He'd have been cranky, too, if someone woke him in the middle of the night.
So, cowboy, how did the other guy fare?
Claire asked, peeling the bandage back to inspect the wound. It had stopped bleeding, and the teeth marks made a clear semicircle encompassing most of the upper part of the ear, parts of it torn right through.
You're lucky you still have it.
Yeah, he didn't fare so well. It was a goddamn cannibal.
Oh? How many?
Just the one. Ragland didn't know if it was the flickering lamplight, but he could have sworn he'd seen a shadow of a smirk on the doctor's face.
How did you let that happen? I mean, if it was just one.
He clenched his jaw. Snuck up on me, Claire stepped back from Ragland and reached into a cupboard. She pulled out a swatch of fabric and a glass jar filled with clear liquid. Upending the bottle onto the cloth, she leaned in and dabbed his ear, without warning. Ragland flinched. Jesus, what is that stuff?
Moonshine.
Moonshine? Ow! Claire added more to the cloth, cleaning the wound on his ear with thoroughness. Ragland winced and sucked in a breath.
Be quiet, you big baby. I'm almost done.
He gritted his teeth, breathing a sigh of relief when she finally finished and went looking for some gauze. After a minute of rattling drawers and tossing their contents around, Claire returned with a small dish of greenish cream. Ragland raised an eyebrow. What's that?
An ointment to stop infection.
He watched her scoop out a blob with her finger. It doesn't look good.
Well, did you think we stockpiled a decade's worth of antiseptic cream? It's perfectly fine. No one's died from it yet. Made from golden seal.
Golden seal?
It's a plant. A leafy green that tends to grow further south. We've cultivated our own here. Saved a fair few folk from losing limbs, or worse. Sepsis doesn't play around.
Ragland was impressed, noticing for the first time that one whole wall of her office was lined with cabinets filled with ointments and medicine that also appeared to have been made locally. Resourceful. I could learn a thing or two.
Even an old man like you.
Yeah, even an old man like me, he smirked. I'm 34, just so you know.
Still, the oldest we've seen. Where do you come from?
Claire started to apply the green paste to his ear. It felt cool and soothing, and the sensation robbed his thoughts from the question. His exhaustion didn't help. The adrenaline from the fight had worn off, leaving him exhausted.
No comment?
Oh, sorry. South. I'm from the South.
South,
she said, showing him a mocking smile.
Just south, is it, cowboy?
Yeah, why not? Another huff.
Keep your secrets then, old man. Let's close this up.
She finished the application of the golden seal paste, grabbed some of the gauze and fresh wrap, and cut a few small strips off with a pair of scissors.
Don't move,
she said, as she began to dress and wrap the wound. Ragland obeyed, hoping her focus on treatment had let him off the hook. But as she stepped away to admire her handiwork, she brushed her hands together and folded them under her armpits.
Come back day after tomorrow for a dressing change. So, you've been a whole lot of trouble in just the few days since you showed up. What's the deal?
Deal? Claire's patience with his ambiguity hit zero. He could see it. She pointed to the door and looked down at the floor.
Go on. We're all done here. You can be someone else's problem.
Thanks for patching me up, Ragland said, as he grabbed his backpack from reception where he'd dropped it.
It's okay,
she said, pushing the door open and holding it for him.
Try office hours next time, huh?
Will do, he said, tipping an imaginary hat as he went through. Outside, he inhaled a lungful of cold, fresh air. His ear felt better already, the pain having subsided to a dull throb. Up above the hills, he spied the moon sinking low behind the branches. If he had any luck left in the tank, he might catch a few hours' sleep at the creaky motel. Shouldering the backpack, he took a quick glance back at the dark windows of the doctor's office, bit his lip, and went on his way through the sleepy, dark streets of Bakerstown. Sunlight was streaming through the windows of the creaky when Ragland woke up. All things considered, he didn't feel too bad as he sat on the edge of his bed. His leg muscles were sore from the run back, but his bandaged ear had gone from a dull throb to just feeling kind of heavy. He thought about his next move. The overwhelming urge to get back on the road fought with a growing notion that maybe it would be better to hunker down in Bakerstown until he had more of a bead on the cannibal threat. He was sure Marley's earlier offer would still be on the table, and he was happy to help out to earn his keep. He went round back to where he'd had the shower on his last stay. A second shower in a week was unthinkable, especially given how cold the last one was, so he settled with lifting the lid of the barrel, splashing cold water on his face, and smoothing down his hair. Feeling rejuvenated, he wiped his hands on his jeans and went out into the street. It was still relatively early, and few people were about. He decided to head to Simon's rather than disturbing Marley after her interrupted night. He'd walked most of the way when he spotted Simon speaking with a man on horseback outside the cafe. The man bent and helped the Canadian take a sack that was laying over his saddle. Ragland hung back, not wanting to intrude, but the interaction came to a quick close, both men shaking hands before the rider turned and rode by Ragland, headed towards the gate. Ragland gave the rider a cursory nod as he passed. Out-of-town delivery? It made sense. Settlements over the years had redeveloped trade. So far, he hadn't seen a distillery, so he could only surmise that Claire had gotten the stash of moonshine from a neighboring settlement. "Morning," Simon called. "I didn't expect to see you again. No offense." He smiled. "None taken. Need a hand?" Simon busied himself with the mysterious sack of goods and nodded to some crates stacked next to the wall on the sidewalk. "Sure, why not? Good way to earn breakfast. I'm guessing that's why you're here, right? Folk love those honey oats." "Just happy to help. But those oats were damn good," Ragland replied, bending and lifting one of the crates up, taking care to use his legs to take the strain. It would be easy to blow one's back out. The thing weighed a good 30 or more pounds. He followed Simon in, through to the back where he was stacking a walk-in pantry. Ragland was surprised to see small containers of ice littered about, preserving other goods, and even spied jars of milk amongst them. "How did you manage that?" Ragland inquired, placing the crate down and stretching, checking out the ice with his fingers. Simon smirked. "Old Wild West trick. It's why we keep Jenny around." "Jenny? Sorry, I can't remember." "The chronologist here. She keeps track of all books and records." "Right. So we found a way to store ice during the summer," he explained, following Ragland back out to the street to collect the last of the food. "We carve up the ice from rivers and haul it back here. There's a cave not far. We used that at first. Then Jenny read about how they would dig great big holes in cellars back in the 1800s and cover the ice in straw to keep it cold enough through the summer." "Jesus," Ragland said. "That's impressive work." The two big men finished stocking the pantry, or what now served as a walk-in refrigerator, in quick time and stepped back into the main cafe bar area. Ragland took a seat at the nearest table while Simon navigated the kitchen, pouring oats into a large pot before filling it with milk and water. "Come to think of it, I heard about an ice cave, just west of here. It's a week-long hike, but we did too. But it's too far, and we can get ice locally without any risk. Besides, it'd melt before we got it back." "True. No bother, eh? Look at us now." Simon's smile was broad and lit up his entire face. Ragland watched Simon cook and busy himself with kitchen prep for the day, in between stirring the big pot. He briefly considered mentioning the cannibal business, but it wasn't his style. He didn't gossip, and if anything needed to be announced, he'd leave it for Marley to do the announcing. Simon had served up the oats, and he was about to take his first spoonful when Marley came through the door, the morning sun bathing her in its warm yellow light to ensure the entrance was a memorable one.
"Morning, Simon. Morning, Josh."
Ragland jolted at the use of his first name. He'd gotten used to people referring to him by his surname, and it had stuck. Over the years, he'd fallen into the habit, whenever prompted, of giving his surname. As unaccustomed to it as he was, it sure beat old man. "Morning," he said, taking a quick spoonful of his breakfast as she sidled up to him.
"When you're done with breakfast, can I have you for a few minutes? Now that you'll be a Bakerstown resident for a while, I think it's time we see where we can put you to good use."
Ragland caught the edge of Simon's smirk and raised his eyebrows at Marley. "Resident? Cut the crap, old-timer. You're staying put." His refilled spoon paused halfway back to his mouth. He'd already come close to making the decision to stay for the winter. He let Marley's bold certainty push him over the line. "How's Alex?" he asked. Marley flashed her eyes briefly to Simon, then back to Ragland, hands going to her hips.
"He's fine. All taken care of."
"Right," he said, looking down at the glistening streaks of honey in his oats. "Best get this porridge down me, then. Don't want me passing out of hunger while you work me into the ground."
"Excellent," Marley nodded. "I think I know exactly where to put you."
Chapter 16. "Cabbages?" Ragland asked, fiddling with his beard as he surveyed the small farm they'd made for themselves on the edge of town.
"You got it in one, old man. That back of yours is not going to give up on us, is it?"
Marley quipped, grinning and sharing a laugh with a few of the other townsfolk, all in overalls and jeans, getting down and dirty in the mud. Ragland held out his hand, and she placed some well-worn gardening gloves in them. "I'm sure it'll be fine."
"Good. And if I hear you've been slacking,"
she joked, after pointing out the row he'd be working on,
"I'll haul your ass back through the gate myself."
"Roger," he said, crouching down at the first cabbage, grabbing it with both hands and beginning to pull. Before he could yank it free from the earth, a kid no older than 14 stopped him. He wore dungarees and a brown cap backwards on his head.
"No, like this."
Ragland stood up, and the kid stepped forward, flattened the large outer leaves to the ground, then wrapped his right hand around the main head, tilting it and slicing the stalk with the short knife in his other hand. The boy tossed it in the empty wheelbarrow next to Ragland's row, then moved back to his own row. "Thanks, kid," he said, and got a smile in return. Turning back to his own line of cabbages, he noticed a few of the farmers nudging each other and laughing. Grumbling under his breath, still not quite able to comprehend the turn of events, he pulled his new knife from his boot and tried his luck with the cabbage. Nothing to it, he thought, and plunked it down in the wheelbarrow. By midday, he was warmer than he'd felt in days and had discarded his jacket hours before. Now, with his sleeves rolled up, he'd gotten so involved with the work that he missed the call for a lunch break. A small hand slapped his back, and Ragland peered up at the offender. It was the kid who had shown him the way of the cabbage. "What?"
"We stopped for food."
"Already?" The kid nodded.
"Sure, we got a lot more to do. Kale, broccoli, beets, potatoes."
"Kale. Christ, I'd rather eat."
"I think he gets it, Odin. Leave the poor man alone."
The voice came from a black woman, her hair tied back by a piece of cloth. Ragland nodded to her, which she returned in kind. He stood up, pulled off his gloves, and walked to the end of the row and across to a small table. It was laden with plates of thick-cut bread and a large ceramic crock-pot.
"Hey there,"
said the woman who had chided Odin.
"New here? Name's Viola. Don't mind Odin. He's our special boy. He likes to talk. Always been that way."
"No bother to me. Kid seems a solid worker. Helped me out at the beginning there. I'm Ragland. Josh." He saw Odin tap his arm repeatedly, then shuffle along to grab a piece of bread, which he placed against his lips for a moment, as if enjoying the texture. What do you mean, special? Something wrong with him?
Oh, no,
Viola replied, grabbing a bowl next to the large pot.
Nothing wrong. We've read into it, and we think he has a mild form of autism. He struggles in the classroom, too.
Is that why he's out here with you folk?
In part. He's not a fan of school, then.
Viola shook her head, picked up a ladle, and scooped the steaming hot chicken broth into a bowl. Ragland's mouth watered.
Not quite, she said. Comes and goes. Some days he doesn't mind the indoors. Some days he can't stand it. But since he was young, he's been great with his hands. Not always the farm. We get him to help on the building, too, or sewing. Rahul has even taken him in as an early apprentice. You met Rahul yet?
Ragland rolled his eyes, taking the ladle from Viola and serving himself a generous portion.
I have had the pleasure. Oh, you have you?
Is he like that with everyone?
Just strangers, she said. He's protective. One of the first to set up Bakerstown way back. Guy's done the hard yards.
He nodded. Perhaps he had been too quick to judge Rahul. After all, he was a stranger in a world grown more paranoid about the nameless. Viola grinned.
You won't have hurt his feelings. Rahul's one of the toughest here.
Hell yeah, he is. A stocky guy a few inches shorter than Ragland had spoken. He pushed past one of the other harvesters and began ladling the soup into his bowl like he hadn't eaten in a week.
This is David, Viola said, her voice tightening. He's one of our hunters.
Best in Bakerstown, he roared,
placing his soup down to feign shooting an arrow from a bow.
Ragland held out a hand for him to shake, but he either missed or ignored it, instead grabbing a slice of bread, dunking it into the soup and then into his mouth without missing a beat.
Incredible, David said, around the food in his mouth.
Simon does it again.
He seemed to notice Ragland again.
So, you're the new one.
Yep, Ragland replied, shuffling along with Viola to grab a piece of bread.
Killed those cannibals a day south?
Yep. David laughed.
You don't talk much, do you? What's up with that?
A man much taller than Ragland rocked up to the table, grabbing his soup, followed by another two very muscular-looking guys, all wearing thick winter jackets and carrying guns, axes, and bows.
Maybe he doesn't like you, David, one of the men said.
He was a tall black man with a deep voice.
Can't be that, Travis. Just can't be. Everyone likes me.
Viola snorted. You may be good with a bow, David, but you sure are full of shit. The men, including Travis, laughed. He shot them a menacing look, and the laughter petered out. Turning, he noticed Ragland watching him, and the scowl swiftly morphed into a humorless smile that was somehow more menacing. This time, David held out a hand.
Nice to meet another hunter.
He gestured to the men.
This is Travis, Viola's brother. Big boy here is Matthew. Some call him Blackbeard. Can you see why? Ha ha. And yeah, this is Sang-hoon. Don't worry, he's Korean, not Chinese.
Travis thumped him, and Viola hissed. Come on, man. David held up his hands in mock apology.
Sorry. He's a good boy. He's one of the good ones.
Sang-hoon held out a hand of his own to Ragland.
Just call me Sang, friend. Friend?
David scoffed.
You only just met the asshole. He saved Kid, Sang replied. And? Kid is always getting into trouble. Why should he get the blowjob welcome party? I mean, he could be anyone, right? No offense. Say, what's your name again? Joshua, right?
Ragland had practically crushed the bread in his hand as flat as pita.
That's right,
Right. Okay, well, good to meet you, Josh, he said, closing the space between them until his face was inches away from Ragland's. We'll keep in touch. You see, we're a bit like protectors here in Bakerstown. We keep an eye on our own. Viola had heard enough, judging by the hand on her hip. Cut that shit out, David. Travis, why do you hang around with this jerk? He's got a point, sis. David laughed, stepping away from the newcomer, and thumped Travis on the shoulder, causing his soup to slosh onto the ground. Yep. Come on. Let's go eat. See you around, Joshua. The four men left, Sang the only one to give Ragland a half-smile. They strolled over to horses hitched up by a tree and walked back toward town, still holding their soup and leading their horses with them. Ragland turned to Viola. Care to explain why I haven't met that crew before? They were probably out hunting, she said. Best you keep away. If you think Rahul doesn't like strangers, you haven't dealt with the Baker's boys. Baker's boys. Mm-hmm. It's what they call themselves. She and Ragland sat down and began to eat their meal in silence. He was hungry enough to let the topic hang for a moment, eager to fill his stomach and forget about it. Once he'd mopped the last of the soup up with his flattened bread, he wiped his mouth. They some sort of local gang? They seem to think so, but no, more like a militia. Yes, David's an asshole, but generally they mean well. Of course, they can get carried away. Looking for purpose, I guess. Aren't we all? Viola gave Ragland a quick glance, then smirked. You're a man of mysteries, aren't you? Don't know about that. No sooner had they stacked their empty dishes into a box next to the food when Marley appeared, Kit at her side. Ragland could tell by her face that sleep and food had worked wonders. She wore a mustard beanie over her dark hair and a meek smile. Hi, all. How's the work? A chorus of nods and choice words from all the farmers greeted their mayor. Marley seemed satisfied as she walked over to Ragland and Viola. How's everything going? Marley asked. All good, he said, then nodded at Kit, who gave him a half-smile. He's not slowing us down too much, if that's what you're getting at, Marley. Viola and Marley both chuckled, Kit still watching Ragland. Good to hear. Well, I just wanted to pop by. We've got another keen pair of hands who wants to muck right in. That good with you, V? It sure as hell is. How you feeling, Kit? Viola asked, getting up and putting a hand on her face affectionately, checking her over. Kit smiled. Much better. Like, totally different. Marley raised her hands up and clapped. All right, then. I'll leave her in your capable hands. If you could swing by with the yield numbers later, that'd be great. Sure thing, Viola called back. Marley already a few strides toward the road. Oh, check on David and the boys, will you? Why's that? Marley shouted. They're down jacks, probably. Getting their game seen to. You know what they're like. Ragland saw Viola tilt her head towards him. Marley seemed to get the gist of what her friend was saying and waved. Loud and clear, V. See you later. What was that all about? He asked. She took Kit over to the field, finding another pair of gloves for her. Never you mind. Lunch is over. These vegetables don't pick themselves. That night, as he readied for bed, as weary from the hard day's work as he'd been in a long time, he was disturbed by a light knock on the door. It was Marley and Alex. I've decided to send a team of 3 on a scouting mission to see exactly what we might be facing if these cannibals decide to pay us a visit. I see. Who would that be? Young Alex here. He knows the territory as good as the hunters, and 2 of them. Travis and Sang.
Just scouting? He asked, looking at Alex.
Yeah, just scouting. I made it clear that they are not to engage. Just find their location and numbers if they can, and then get the hell back here.
Good. Sounds like a plan. Marley looked at him carefully, and he wondered if she was waiting for him to volunteer. Truth was, he was enjoying the farm work and having somewhere to call home. He was in no rush to hit the road again, especially in the company of others.
Okay, then,
she said, after a pause, and stood up.
Just thought you'd like to know.
I appreciate it, he said, and then to Alex. Don't take any chances out there. Chapter 17. The next 3 days passed without trouble for Ragland as he helped the rest of the townsfolk make sure the approaching winter didn't freeze their food in the ground. Each morning, a step outside the creaky motel seemed to greet a deeper chill than the day before. His morning routine led him down to Simon's to enjoy a half measure of coffee, fresh merchandise from a long cart ride down to the southwest. Ragland hadn't had coffee in years, and Simon mentioned it was a delicacy for them in these parts, too. It took a long time for the supply team to travel, but despite the risk, it had always worked out well so far. Simon explained they didn't just come back with coffee, but rice and other old-world trinkets and bits and pieces, too. Our traders go well armed, he explained one morning. They take weapons and things to trade. Rahul is making quite a name for Bakerstown steel. If things get nasty, though, well, they know how to handle themselves. And coffee sure boosts the morale around here. Ragland was inclined to agree. On the 4th day, he'd really gotten into the swing of things, meeting Viola and the others down in the dirt to pick potatoes, now that the cabbage and kale had been farmed. With half a week under his belt as a Bakerstown citizen, his face had grown familiar to the local folk, earning the occasional nod and wave from some. He got on well with the butcher, Jack, and stopped for a chat with him whenever they passed each other. He even had the pleasure of sharing an all-too-brief talk with Clint, the teacher, who, even though he was at least 10 years younger than Ragland, was knowledgeable about the old world. But his heart had been softened by the farmers, Odin especially, who had taken a liking to him and always found a way to make sure he was next to Ragland when they were picking. Viola hadn't missed it. On the 5th day, just after lunch, she giggled on the way back to the field, nudging him. Might want to start calling yourself Thor. Why's that? He said, slipping his gloves back on. Odin has grown fond of you very quickly. Must be your calming influence, I guess. Ragland looked over and spotted Odin pressing his hands into the dirt and watching the earth pour off his fingers. Then, once it had all returned to the ground, he did it again. Then the kid looked up at him and smiled. Maybe he does, but wasn't Odin Thor's father? Viola laughed again. Probably. Sorry, Norse mythology isn't my strongest topic. On the 6th night, with the sun tucked behind the hills and the inky black sky studded bright with a billion stars, the townsfolk had gathered at Simon's bar for a harvest supper to celebrate the end of the season. They filled the sidewalk with wooden tables and erected additional torches and fire pits. Marley had extended the invitation to Ragland, who felt just as comfortable, after a long day in the field, as spending the evening alone in his shack, getting shut-eye. Not on my watch, she had said, jabbing his chest with her little finger. You did good this week. Plus, Simon has a surprise. You won't want to miss it. Simon's surprise turned out to be a large batch of beer, brewed right in Bakerstown. It had been the best-kept secret for months. Normally, the lubrication on offer at the supper was mulberry wine or moonshine, so it created a buzz of excitement, with the sea of faces smiling. Before anyone could take a good sip, Marley raised her stein into the air, surrounded by her people. To Joshua Ragland, for making Bakerstown his home,
at least for a while, and for some mighty fine work on the farm. Hear, hear."
A chorus of cheers erupted, and everyone clinked their steins and drank as if dying of thirst. Ragland tipped his gingerly, not having had an alcoholic drink since he was 22. "You didn't have to say that," Ragland said, savoring the sweet, hoppy taste.
"Oh, I sure as hell did," Marley replied, nudging him. "Not too bad for an old man, you know."
They both smiled. Simon, busy at the bar, nodded to Ragland and shouted over,
"Like it?"
Ragland raised it up as a salute.
"It's great."
The big man went back to serving his friends and family. From behind the same crowd of people, David materialized and ambled over to Ragland. He looked between him and Marley, as if contemplating his choice of words.
"You sure you should be toasting this guy, Marley? We don't know a goddamn thing about him." "I recall you were always a troublemaker back in the early days, during the fighting. But I gave you a second chance, and a third. Still here, ain't you?"
Ragland bit into his cheek to stop himself from smirking. David hadn't seen the quick reply coming.
"That's not the same thing," he stuttered. "He's proven himself. He's worked hard, earned his keep. You did the same, David."
Out from Ragland's left, Jack the butcher appeared, rubbing his hands to keep warm and eyeing up the bar for a beer.
"Just got Rufus and Charlie all set up on watch. Is there a problem here?"
David shot him a withering look, taking a large gulp of his beer, letting the drips slick his chin.
"What do you make of the old man, butcher?"
Annoyed at being spoken about as if he wasn't there, Ragland kept his cool, not moving an inch, but watching David's body language for any sign of aggression. No one else had noticed anything over the noise of the crowd.
"He saved Kit. What else is there to say?"
"So he says," David replied.
Marley and Jack jumped in at the same time. Jack asked what the hell that meant, and Marley told him to relax and ease up on the drink. It had been a long time since any of them had taken in any volume of alcohol. But Ragland's deep voice broke through their retorts, drawing David's attention. "Listen, there's clearly something you're not happy about. That's fine by me. You don't have to like me, and I don't have to like you. So there's nothing stopping you from heading back to your buddy." He nodded in the direction of Matthew, the one they called Blackbeard, who loitered near the back of the bar. David took a step forward. The two stared at each other, tension suddenly palpable in the air. Ragland placed his beer down on a table and drew himself to his full height, his hands slack by his side. Just as David squared up, the sound of piano filled the room. The tension melted away as the bars started to bounce, people dancing and spinning each other around. With barely any room to move, David and Ragland were quickly jostled apart and swept into the mix. The man's stare conveyed more than words ever could to Ragland. It was a look he'd seen in men before, the look of a killer. Chapter 18. The headache the following morning was almost worth it. Ragland peeled himself out of bed in the early hours before the sun had risen, throwing on his jacket and gloves, before meandering his way through Bakerstown in search of nothing in particular, except for fresh air and respite from his spinning head. Ragland's wandering took him back to the gate, where Charlie and Rufus were still standing watch, the low mumble of their voices barely audible from the ground.
"Mind if I join you, boys?"
he asked, craning his neck. Two heads appeared, dark splotches against the moonlit sky. There was a brief conversation.
"Sure,"
Rufus said, tapping the ladder.
"Come on up."
Ragland climbed his way up and hoisted himself onto the wooden walkway. When he stretched to full height, he towered over the two teenagers. Rufus's eyes widened, and Ragland smiled to put him at ease before turning to look out over the trees, textured smudges in the dark, highlighted by the three-quarter moon. His warm exhale produced a cloud of vapor.
"You have one of those hangover things?"
Charlie asked, leaning on his bow, which was almost the same height as him. "Something like that," Ragland replied. Rufus chuckled.
"Alex gave us a little beer. Haven't felt like that before. So that's what you old folk used to drink before the fall?"
"Hey, kid, I ain't old," he said, pointing at his head.
"You see any gray hair?"
"No offense,"
Rufus shrugged. "But you're the oldest person we've seen. Literally ever."
Charlie backed him up.
"It's true. Sorry, dude."
"Dude." Ragland pressed his thumb and middle finger into his eyes and rubbed them. It did nothing to alleviate the pain, so he gave up and looked down at their water flask. "Mind?" They shook their heads, still grinning, and watched as Ragland took a few thirsty gulps, spilling some onto his beard. A tangled beast that could do with some taming. He handed them back the flask, gripped the edge of the fence, and watched the world in silence for as long as it took to let the nausea and spinning subside. The first tinge of dawn crept over the top of the hills, slowly illuminating the dark woods in the orange, yellow, and rust shades of late autumn. It was a pretty sight.
"Is it true,"
Rufus said around a yawn,
"that you were, fended off like 20 cannibals on your own and saved Kit?"
Ragland raised an eyebrow. "What?" Charlie thumped Rufus in the arm.
"Not cool, dude."
There it was again. Dude. It sounded foreign to his ears. He hadn't heard the word in years, and to hear it from a pair of kids in a small Pennsylvania settlement, a clean decade after most of the population had been wiped out, amazed him, especially when they would have been about 5 years old at the most during the fall. "What have you heard?" They both started to speak at the same time, which only frustrated Ragland more. He put up a hand. "One at a time, boys. What have you heard?" Rufus looked at his friend Charlie, who nodded. He went on to explain where he'd heard the rumors. It sounded to Ragland like a classic case of embellished Chinese whispers. Just talk and town gossip that grew in grandeur every time it passed from one person to another. "Okay.
So it's true? You really did that?"
Rufus said, his eyes wide. Ragland shook his head. "No. A quarter of that. And it's not like the stories out there. It's messy and it's hard, and you never get away clean. Rarely. Don't think about any grand adventures or trying to be a hero. Your friend Kit thought the same, and if I hadn't gotten lucky, you'd never have seen her again." Charlie and Rufus nodded, seemingly sobered, then looked over to the ladder, which was creaking as someone climbed it. Ragland turned, half expecting David's face, but it was Kit.
"So, am I, interrupting anything?"
"Nope," said Ragland. He watched the boys shuffle aside to give Kit room to climb up onto the crowded ledge that ran the length of Bakerstown's southern perimeter. A perfect platform for recon, hangover recovery, and gossip. "I was just telling your friends that grand adventures out there," he gestured out over the forest, "aren't all they're cracked up to be. In fact, they'd be silly to go off without the right preparation, or telling someone." A small smile creased her lips. She wore a thick puffer jacket Ragland hadn't seen before, jeans, and the same hiking boots as before. Was this a morning stroll, or something else? She seemed well slept and prepared.
"Does that make me silly?"
"Yes," Ragland said without hesitation. She rolled her eyes.
"Harsh, old man, but fair."
He was relieved that their awkwardness after his departure seemed to have been forgotten.
"So I've come up with a solution for that." He eyed her. Don't get any ideas about going out there again. Oh, for sure. At least, not yet. I figured I just needed a bit of training, you know? Training? Yeah, so I can kill the cannibals when they come. Ragland groaned. Charlie and Rufus looked back and forth between them, clearly excited at the prospect. This conversation is over. Ragland nodded to the boys and climbed back down the ladder. Once on the ground, he made it about 20 paces up the street before Kit caught up. I'm only asking for you to train me. Don't you think that it makes sense? Sure, if you want to get yourself killed. Kit huffed, jumping in front of Ragland and crossing her arms. You're not fooling anyone, old man. Ragland stopped, tilting his head back and silently counting to 10. When he looked back at Kit, he saw a bitter determination, an expression he'd seen plenty of times, years before. His hand went up subconsciously to touch the onyx pendant, but stopped himself. Kit had noticed. I'm not her, you know, like I'm my own person. You're not going to stop, are you? Her eyes were resolute, and he would have bet money that she'd picked up a lot of her ways from Marley. Nope. Not until you agree to train me, especially if you buy half of what Alex has been saying. Ragland noticed movement further down the street and narrowed his eyes as he peered over her shoulder. A figure disappeared into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared. He wasn't sure if it was paranoia. However, from the person's build, he thought it might be David. Fine, he conceded, splitting his attention between her and the place the mysterious lurker had disappeared. We'll meet on the far end of town, near the fields. Bring a bow and some arrows. Yes! You won't regret it. So, when do you want to start? Now. Kit paused, not quite believing him, then darted away at a run, down one of the side streets, toward the home she shared with Alex. He began to walk again, perhaps spooking the lurker who materialized from the shadows briefly before disappearing around a corner. Hooded though they were, it was David. He was almost certain. Fully awake, the ebb of his hangover subsiding, Ragland walked to the corner, giving it a wide berth in case of ambush, and looked up the street. Nothing. He was gone. What is that man's gripe? Ragland puzzled. No matter. Clear-headed, without last night's infusion of alcohol, he decided that if David started trouble, he'd go to Marley and set things straight. He was the stranger in town, not David, and the last thing he needed, with the possible arrival of a horde of cannibals, was to provoke the town into kicking him out. Chapter 19. When Kit arrived, she had the bow and arrows as requested, but argued that maybe they should move straight to hand-to-hand combat. I already know how to shoot an arrow. Didn't I catch you 2 nice turkeys? Sneaking up on a fat wild turkey and sticking it from 10 feet is different to shooting at a person, especially if they are running at you waving an axe or a blade. She couldn't argue with this logic. All right, show me your form, he said. The two had found an open piece of land by a tall cedar. The earth was filled with roots and therefore had never been farmed. Ragland had marked the tree with a piece of flint, chipping away some of the bark to make a circular target about 8 inches across. Then, after much protest that she could shoot from further, he'd convinced her to stand only 20 feet away. She lifted the bow and knocked the arrow, drawing it back to her cheek, and aimed at the cedar. Okay, stop. That won't do. Let me show you. She rolled her eyes and passed it to him. Ragland lifted Kit's bow and pulled the bowstring back, pulling it until it ran dead center from the tip of his nose and down the middle of his chin. See how it runs straight, nose to chin? No one shoots like that, Kit protested, chewing at her thumbnail. They hold it to their cheek. Well, they're doing it wrong. All of them? Ragland dropped the bow and looked back at her. Yes. then rubbed his eyes. No, not technically. Do you want to learn proper form or not? Well, yeah. I kind of don't want to die, or almost die. Not like before. He passed the bow back to her, along with one of the 3 arrows she had brought along with her. They had been handcrafted by someone in the town, judging by the wood of the shaft and the not-so-clean fletching. The tip, however, was sharp and purposeful. Here, you go. I want your left arm bent slightly. Notch the arrow and pull back to your chin, like I showed you. All right, Gramps, she laughed, copying his instruction. Okay, I think I'm ready, she said. Then loose. What? Shoot the damn arrow, kid. And she did. It sailed through the air, hitting the tree trunk with a deep thunk, missing the mark completely, a good half-foot below the rough circle. Her sound of exasperation made Ragland smirk. It was only her first go, and she landed it in the tree. Most would have done worse. Okay, he said, walking up to Kid and kicking her feet with his. Set these apart and stand more side on. Try to aim a little higher there, too. Here you go. Ragland passed her the next arrow. This time, Kit's attempt made it within 3 inches of the mark. She spun around on the spot, her mouth open. Oh my God! Did you friggin' see that shit? I'm a natural! Steady on, he smirked, raising a hand. Plenty more to learn. Take another shot, then collect the arrows for another round. He sat on the grass as she went to retrieve the arrows. He half expected her to call him for assistance, as they were embedded deep in the wood of the cedar, but as stubborn as him, she worked and pulled at them until she had collected all 3. Of her next 3 shots from 40 yards, 3 were on target. 1 just missed. Not bad, kid. Not bad at all. Not bad? I am friggin' awesome. Well, don't get too carried away. You had skill before, but now that you have the correct technique, no turkey will be safe. Your technique helps, I guess, she conceded. I want you to practice more on your own this afternoon. See if you can get some more arrows. Maybe have a friend doing retrieval so you don't wear yourself out. Do 10 from 30 feet. If you get them all, then move out to 40. When you can hit the target 10 times in a row from 40 feet without a miss, you're ready. Easy peasy. Do you remember what I told you about the second arrow when you're being rushed? Yep. Don't try to shoot. Just use it as a stabbing weapon. Good. Now, we can move on to self-defense in close quarters. Ragland picked some soft ground, away from any protruding roots, and faced Kit, rolling up his sleeves. Next, we're going to learn what to do when the fight gets a little closer. What, like kung fu? Ragland raised his eyebrows. No, not exactly. I want you to walk up and try and punch me. Kit's face changed. Huh? Punch me. Try to, at least. Are you serious? Haven't got all day, kid. She positioned herself, clenching her fists, then charged forward, hurling a knuckled blow toward the left side of his face. Ragland stepped to the left at the last moment, grabbed her arm, and yanked it down gently. With the momentum of her missed punch, Kit went flying, sprawling into the ground. Hey, she said, coughing and getting back up, dusting the dirt from her coat. She unzipped it and tossed it aside. Ragland did the same. They would start to build up quite a bit of heat from the workout. The corners of his mouth went up. That all you got? Kit tried again, falling foul to the same trick. On the third go, the same. But on the fourth, Ragland stepped the other way, into Kit, and remained still, his arms outstretched. Her body collided into his, sending her stumbling backward. Hey, what gives? I thought you were supposed to be showing me how to kill and stuff. I am. Kit rolled her eyes, kicking in the grass. Yeah, right. You're just being a jerk. I can take it, you know. Just show me the moves. These are the moves. It's not about spinning kicks and uppercuts. It's about evasion,
and protecting yourself. You can't kill anyone if you're dead.
Fair point, I guess.
Come at me again, but this time do it slowly, and I'll show you why. Kit bared her teeth, moving the hair from her eyes, and clenched her fists again, ready to fight. She stepped in, slowly this time, and threw a half-hearted punch at Ragland. Matching her speed, Ragland stepped left from the punch, drawing her arm in the same direction as her momentum, and jabbing his fingers to her ribs. Look what I've done here. Kit stopped, lowering her head around to look at his stiffened fingers. He prodded her side. If I had something sharp, it'd be over. I could do it here, here, or even here. Ragland prodded various points of her ribs, then let her go. She looked disheartened as she straightened her shirt.
Fine, she said, finally. So, show me what I'm supposed to do.
First off, kid, you're not meant to go on the attack. You wait. You bait them if you have to. Let them go for the attack first. My dad always said you never attack first, but if they ever start something, you always end it.
Very wise and shit, ain't you?
Ragland shook his head at her little dig. Wax on, wax off. She raised her eyebrow. Never mind. Anyhow, he was right. Now, let's get to business. For the next hour or two, until their stomachs grumbled for a breakfast they'd skipped, Ragland taught Kit how to duck away from an array of different punches, how to lock an arm, and how to throw a proper punch. By the time he was done, Ragland was sweating, even though the day wasn't hot. Kit looked like she could go for another hour. Grabbing up their equipment and jackets, the pair headed back into town, Kit thanking Ragland for the training, before turning left from the main avenue. He fancied a cool-off under the shower before eating, and headed toward the creaky motel, which had somehow become his home. It was the first home he'd had since the early days, hiding out from the invaders in abandoned houses, sometimes for weeks at a time. When he reached the creaky, he stepped in, threw his jacket on the bed, and reached over to the cabinet for the bar of soap and towel Marley had provided. The crack across the back of his head was sudden. It dazed him, and he sprawled over the top of his chest of drawers, the soap skittering across the floor. Dazed, he put a hand up to the back of his head, his fingers coming away slick with red. "Son of a bitch," he cursed, starting to get up before another heavy blow came across his back. A pair of large hands grabbed him from behind, hurling him into the wall. The whole building shook as Ragland crashed to the floor and got to his hands and knees, looking back at his assailant. David. He looked like a man possessed, eyes alert, face red, fingers twitching. Behind him was Blackbeard. Ragland got up slowly, feeling the back of his head again. "You don't want to do this, buddy." David pulled a knife from under his jacket and held it up to Ragland. "I think I do, asshole." David came at him, swinging the blade in quick swiping motions. Ragland backpedaled, and his attacker missed most of his attempts before finally catching Ragland on the arm. He cried out and gripped the wound, blood oozing through his fingers. "Stop!" Ragland panted, bending over slightly and holding out his blood-soaked hand. The local closed in to finish the job, deceived by Ragland's phony surrender, throwing all his weight behind the thrust. The drifter saw it coming a mile off. He sidestepped, caught the knife arm, and rabbit-punched David in the ribcage. He was rewarded by a sharp yelp of pain, and the thug spun out of his grip, clutching at his side. His knife arm wavered as he tried to catch his breath from the unexpected blow. "Oh, you are fucking dead, old man." Oof. Ragland hit him hard. It was a good old-fashioned rugby tackle, his shoulder catching the local in the midriff and sending them both hurtling into Blackbeard. The force of the crash tackle sent them bursting through the door in an explosion of wood and splinters. Cries of surprise and shock met his ears, and looking up, he spotted Marley in the distance, running towards them as he wrestled David for the knife.
Blackbeard rolled away when he saw the mayor, but David was still fighting for control of the weapon. "Stop!" Marley cried, as Ragland finally shook the knife free of David's hand and pushed his forearm down onto his assailant's throat. The blood-streaked Ragland looked up as Marley approached, her face blanched white with shock. Before any of them could say a word, the whine of a siren filled the air, accompanied by more shouts and cries of alarm. "What now?" Ragland wondered. "That's the warning siren at the gate," Marley said. The words were barely out of her mouth when Charlie sprinted into view and ran towards them. He stopped by Marley, bending over to catch his breath. "The gates," he panted. Ragland eased the pressure on David's throat when the other man didn't try to make trouble, but he wasn't ready to let him up just yet. Charlie's eyes widened at the bloodied state of the drifter and David. "Who, Charlie?" snapped Marley. "Who's at the gates?" "Peter and Alex and the hunters. They said the cannibals are coming. A whole damn army of them."
The end of The Drifter, parts 1 to 3. If you're enjoying Scott's audiobook content, please like and subscribe. It's the best way to help out the channel.